This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
How many of the people that were either supportive of or engaged in attempts to set fire to hotels containing refugees this summer will also be people who are sick to death of hearing about the situation in Syria? It's weird, isn't it? I don't have a particularly sparkling insight into that cross-section of society, but the idea that you can not care about the situations and scenarios that create exoduses of humanity while being passionately opposed to the consequences of those exoduses of humanity is yet another illustration of how dangerous it is for disgusting people in public life to offer up simplistic solutions to incredibly complicated problems. But none of us are perfect. None of us know everything, despite sometimes perhaps giving the impression that we think we do. Did you just hear Angela Eagle in the news then? Did you hear that bit about what happens in Germany if you are involved in in people smuggling? The idea that if you were helping somebody make their way, or rather, if you were smuggling somebody towards a country that was not in the European Union, you would not actually be a criminal in Germany. I'm just going to say that again. Remember, in 2016, everybody knew exactly what they were voting for. So huge amounts of the infrastructure of international people smuggling rings are based in Germany, up to and including the actual vessels, as I understand it. The particular types of vessels best suited to those sorts of hazarded crossings are largely concentrated, for reasons, in Germany. And if you voted for Brexit in 2016, you voted to decriminalise involvement in people smuggling in Germany if the people had the United Kingdom as their final destination, as opposed to, for example, France or Spain or Italy or any other country that remains in the European Union. How many times has Boris Johnson or Jacob Rees-Mogg or Nigel Farage acknowledged their role in decriminalising involvement in people smuggling in Germany? A massive contributory factor to the explosion in small boat crossings that we have witnessed since. I find these moments almost unbelievable in their crassness and their consequence, because the conversation still continues. Yesterday I was hearing, we don't want to talk about Brexit. We don't want to talk about Brexit. You literally can't talk about why the government have had to sign a deal with Germany that brings us somewhere closer to where we were before we left the European Union without talking about leaving the European Union. I mean, hands on heart, how many people listening to this right now do you think knew that little wrinkle of UK law outside the world of immigration and asylum? How many people knew that as a direct consequence of Brexit, activities facilitating migrant smuggling to the UK would not be deemed as criminal offences? So Yvette Cooper, the Home Secretary, if this is the stuff that keeps you awake at night, she should be getting carried around the room on your shoulders at the moment, because she has now signed a deal making clear that activities facilitating migrant smuggling to the UK will be deemed criminal offences. Do you know what? I could sit here for an hour talking about this simple thing, not just because the growing clamour from people that told you to vote for Brexit now telling you to stop talking about it, as the job of dealing with the consequences and undoing some of the damage is going to be generational. But because the people who've been encouraged to take their anger out, the anger that should, of course, be directed at the people that told them Brexit was going to be brilliant. Boris Johnson was a stand-up guy. Liz Truss was an economic genius. Austerity was a necessary price to pay for having billionaire bankers in our country. All of those people, the people who told you Liz Truss's budget was a stroke of economic genius, all of those people are directing your anger at refugees, directing your fury at refugees, without acknowledging once that the single most controversial focal point of the entire so-called migrant crisis was caused in large part by our self-imposed removal from the European Union. How many times have you heard that point raised? So the government, a far from perfect operation, I think everyone can agree about that, quietly undoing some of the damage done by Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. David Frost negotiated the deal that rendered people smugglers in Germany non-criminal as long as the people they were smuggling were on their way to the UK. You see what I mean about the importance of these issues that don't get anything like the attention that they should. Also, if the Tories had signed this deal, what do you think they'd be doing now? If the Conservatives had signed a deal that was designed to make life much, much harder, in fact, to recriminal, but they couldn't though, could they? The Tories couldn't do a lap of honour about this because they would have had to admit, we fixed that thing we broke. That's why people want you to stop talking about Brexit. The people who won. You can't not appreciate the comedy of that. I've said it before and I'll say it again. Imagine if in 1967, supporters of the England football team started demanding that we never mention last year's World Cup final ever again. Victory! Shh, don't mention the win. No one ever asks you to be silent about a win if they're proud of the win or if the win has turned out well. So the Tories couldn't even do this. Not only did they fail to address the policy because they probably didn't understand it, but they couldn't charge themselves with the job of undoing it because they did it in the first place. What do you mean? What do you mean people smugglers in Germany aren't criminals? No, they are criminals as long as they're smuggling people to European Union countries. They're not criminals if they're smuggling people to the UK. How the hell did that happen? That's not a phone-in, although I'm tempted. I cannot lie. I'm tempted. How the hell did that happen? Do you think Farage even knows? Do you think he even understands it today? That his beloved Brexit was directly responsible for decriminalising people smugglers? He doesn't care. He's probably off to Dover with his Fisher-Price binoculars so he can rub his thighs while actually there aren't any boats crossing the channel at the moment. Always breaking things. It's extraordinary, isn't it? But there it is. You voted for it, right? And everyone knew exactly what they were voting for. What do we want? We want people smugglers in Germany to be decriminalised. When do we want it? Well, 2016, please. Or if that's too soon, maybe when David Frost's deal kicks in 2019, 2020. Sensational, right? Sensational. But I don't want to talk about that today. I want to talk about being a refugee. Because I don't think we've given it anything like enough thought over the last few years. And I think those of us who are not conned into believing that the country's problems are caused by the least wealthy or the most vulnerable and are instead caused by the status quo and inequality, dishonesty and deception, I don't think we talk about it enough either. So you look at the deep desire, already evident, of Syrian refugees and asylum seekers to go back to Syria. And you realise that there are elements of this entire conversation that you've never had. That there are elements of this entire conversation that you've never contemplated. Forgive me if you have contemplated it. I haven't. And that's somewhat embarrassing, really. But what would you be like? Imagine if this country fell into the clutches of someone like the al-Assad family, right? And you couldn't keep quiet. It was interesting yesterday to acknowledge, not to learn, but to remember that you could live a relatively peaceful life in Syria as long as you didn't cause any trouble whatsoever for the regime or draw any attention to yourself. And silence is violence is a phrase that's become popular in recent years. I think it's really unfair. I think the massive majority of people, when offered the opportunity between peace and stability and biting your tongue, would choose peace and stability and biting your tongue. Some people, you can't say some of us because you don't know whether you'd be in that category until the pip started squeaking. But people who feel a biological urge almost to speak truth to power were doomed. And then, of course, that's not just political prisoners. There's all sorts of corruption and unpleasantness unfolding in countries like that. So if the UK turned into a country like that and you could not live here anymore, and you made your way to Paris or Patagonia, how much of your life would be spent dreaming of coming back? Isn't it extraordinary that we've allowed ourselves, all of us have allowed ourselves in this country, to be turned into a populace that thinks almost immediately of refugees and asylum seekers as being traditional migrants following irregular routes. So being the Middle Eastern equivalent of Romanian and Italian people who came here under freedom of movement because they felt that the life would be better or the opportunities would be greater or that it was better suited to their sensibilities and their skill set. And somehow we've all fallen into the trap of thinking that Syrians are doing the same thing, or that Iraqis are doing the same thing, or that Afghans are doing the same thing. Now, obviously, the asylum they seek is infinitely preferable to staying in the war zones or the horrific regimes that they have fled. But I don't know whether we've ever really made enough of that question of wanting to go home. One of the lines I read in the news this morning was about the new administration in Syria, which early doors seems to be doing all the things that our Syrian callers yesterday told us they wanted to happen, in terms of telling women they can wear and do what they want, putting in place a prime minister. But the line that really caught my eye was throwing open the borders. The new administration in Syria has thrown open the borders to returning refugees. I don't know how many people. I think there's 30,000 Syrians in this country, and I've never before found myself thinking of their existence as limbo. I don't know why. Even as someone who is politically the polar opposite of the people that followed the clarion call of various disgusting public figures and tried to set fire to hotels this summer. Even as the political polar opposite of that, I have never really grasped the concept of asylum as being temporary. You have to reapply after 5 years. I knew that, and the reason is pretty obvious this week. You reapply for asylum after 5 years because the thing that you have fled may not be there 5 years hence. But what does that mean about the life that you make in the meantime? I mean, everyone puts down roots. Or almost everyone. Almost everyone. Some people are footloose, aren't they? Some people are I envy footloose, but I can't really imagine. There's a brief little window nearly 20 years ago where we toyed with the idea of taking a job in America. But I was really scared. Away from my parents, away from everything that I know. I just didn't quite have what's the word I'm looking for? I didn't quite have the bricks for it. I didn't have the appetite. I think Mrs. O'Brien probably had it more than I did. And it didn't become an argument or anything like that. The issue more or less resolved itself. But that some people would jump at that chance. I got a child who I think will be one of those people who can uproots and settle anywhere in the world. I'm not one of those people. But what if I had to get out of a country and I made my way somewhere else for safety, for security, and I wanted to get back? So, big dice roll this morning. What's that like? I read that they're throwing open the borders. Yesterday, the footage of cars making their way to Damascus from all over was absolutely spectacular. It looked apocalyptic. Going in that direction, I don't remember seeing that before. You know, when something happens in the world, you get the footage of the exodus. What's the I don't even know what the opposite of an exodus is. An introduce? I don't know what the word is. So a regime falls and a population piles back in. Isn't that interesting? So, if you are a refugee or you have been an asylum seeker or you are still caught up in the process, I don't even know how to ask this question. How many people in this category dream of going home? It's a part of the conversation that I don't know that you've ever heard before, because I've never had it. How much of your life is dedicated to going home? 0345 6060 973. I have the million Syrians that Angela Merkel welcomed into the country after the war began. How many of them will be keen to go home? The sad thing is, I don't think it will change the political dial of any of the people who fall for the rhetoric and the bile of the far right. You know, that notion of, there is definitely a level I'd be comfortable with. I think that left the building years ago. But I don't really care about them today. I care about people who dream of going home. Even as you're demonized quite often and denigrated in the country where you have sought safety, you dream of going home. Influx, is that the word? Is that the opposite of exodus? It's got an X in it, so that's a symmetry, a syntactic symmetry at least. But you dream of going home. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. Did you grow up in a family where mum and dad, for reasons, had settled here for reasons of security and safety, but somehow your entire childhood was underpinned by their deep desire to go home. What does it do? We spoke to Mark yesterday. I remember he said to me, my dad's from Damascus, my mum's from Birmingham. There's a duality there that most of us won't recognise. And Dad wants to go home. Dad did go home. What's it like what's it like? I don't want to say what's it like to be a refugee, because it needs that second dimension of contemplation. And it's about wanting to go home. And the reason why I'm talking about this, and I'm not going to beat myself up about it, is that I've never thought of it this way before. The number you need is 0345 6060 973. How many, I suppose I'm asking, how many refugees dream of going home? And given that we can't answer that question objectively, we can only really answer it subjectively. And that would mean you are one of them, or you are the son or the daughter of one of them. And this is what it's like for us. How many refugees dream of going home? And what is it like to live in that limbo, that liminal space, that, as the Yorkshireman would say, neither nout nor summit? Because it's not home, but it is home. And that you haven't got a home because what was your home is not your home because of what it's become. And the place you've made your home is not your home because it's not the place that was your home. And the place that was your home doesn't exist anymore. Good Lord. And how on earth have we all managed to get to this stage of a constant raging debate about refugee, asylum and immigration without ever stopping to have this conversation before? I'm not necessarily expecting you to answer the last question. 0345 6060 973. And this, of course, is true of everybody, not just Syrians. You could be a refugee from anywhere. You could be, it was the Vietnamese boat people was the phrase on everybody's lips when I was growing up. What's it like to make a life here that you really desperately hope is temporary? It's 20 past 10.
James O'Brien on LBC.
2 minutes after 10, and I said the goalposts were the goal mouth was wide. My grandparents, writes Ellie, were refugees from the Spanish Civil War. My lovely abuelo spent his life longing to go back. He had to wait until the death of Franco, by which time his beloved parents had long since died. But when he did finally go back, the country wasn't the same. He no longer felt Spain was home, but he never felt the UK was home either. I hadn't read this a moment ago when I speculated upon this kind of sentiment. But goodness me, Ellie, you've driven smack into the middle of it. Even after having built a family here and worked his socks off all his life, he always felt in limbo. 23 after 10. Carlos is in Hartford in Germany. Carlos, what made you pick up the phone?
Well, you were talking about refugees, and I'm a refugee from Venezuela. And, of course, I'm in Germany. But I can assure you, everybody wants to go home.
I mean, you say the words, and they ring like a bell. It's so clear and presumably so obvious. And yet 99% of the conversations that I hear and have about people in your position never really accommodate this desperate desire to go home, to return.
Yes, if the conditions are good, you can go back. But if you're in danger or something like that, you don't want to go back. Of course, it depends on the situation.
Yes, of course it does. I mean, as I keep saying, it's blindingly obvious when you actually stop to think about it. And so, what does it do to your, I suppose, your life building capacity in Germany? We all think of the future. Some of us think about the future more than others. We think about financial security. We think about retirement. We think about property ownership, job security, career development, children's education. But if there is a simultaneous dream to go back and essentially, for almost any returnee, start again, then does it change your relationship with all of those things I've just described?
Yes, but that depends also on the roots you have laid.
Yes.
If you have a girlfriend or a boyfriend or kids or something like that, taking them out of their homes, the only home they have met,
yes,
it's difficult. So,
what's your situation? Where are you? What are your roots like in Germany now?
I have a German girlfriend, and we are trying to have kids. Right. We have no luck until now. Okay. But I have a good job. I'm an engineer, and I'm a civil engineer, so I'm a refugee, but not your typical refugee.
or
have a master's.
Maybe more typical than we realise. We just prefer to typify people, as particularly in Germany. What does she know about? I mean, does she know that somewhere deep inside you dream of returning to Venezuela?
Yes, of course. She asked, but I told her, no, Germany is my home now. And if we have kids, it's crazy to take them back.
Yes.
Even if they speak the language. But, her or his cousins are in Germany.
Yes.
His grandparents are in Germany, uncle, and stuff like that. So, the family is important. So
well, because you create, you're exactly right. If you have a family, then it's not returning home for them, is it? It's returning to a completely alien and foreign country.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a new. Of course, Venezuela is beautiful and everything, but, they will never have winter again, for example. They have only summer. So.
When you see the convoys of people returning to Damascus, returning to Syria, do you think you feel differently from how, for example, I would feel as somebody with no experience of exodus or fleeing?
Yes, of course, because it's the dream of anybody, I think, that leaves their country in a bad situation. They want to go back. They love their country. I don't know anybody who doesn't love their country. So you see that, and you see, that can maybe be me in 10 years or 5 or 2 or whatever.
Yeah. And yet, as you say, everybody loves their country. And yet, of course, the people who are most easily enraged and riled about refugees and asylum seekers are the people who should theoretically be more attuned to how important it is to love your country, because they never stop claiming that they do. Carlos, good luck, especially with the parenthood issue. I've been where you are, and it doesn't mean that there is light at the end of the tunnel, but there was for us. I hope that gives you a little hope. 27 after 10 is the time. Elsa is in Portsmouth. Elsa, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I agree with what the gentleman said before. I've spent a lot of time in refugee camps in Lesbos, and I've never met a refugee who doesn't want to go home, and it really doesn't matter where they're from. Syrians, Afghans. I've met people from Myanmar, from Congo. And they all flee for different reasons, but I've never met somebody who didn't say, "I want to go home." Unless obviously the situation hasn't changed and it isn't safe to do so. They all have this hope that one day they can go home, that the situation changes. And I'm the daughter of a refugee myself, and I think he's one of the rare exceptions because he fled Egypt in the 1950s because they were Jewish, and at the time, during the Nasser crisis, they were thrown out. And I think he's one of the rare exceptions because the Jews were just not welcome for a very long time, and the only reason they didn't want to go back was that they just never felt safe again. But as a child and with his parents, he would have wanted to go home as well. They remembered.
Just thinking about the historic Jewish experience, and of course the word Exodus and why it's part of our shared vocabulary. It's probably much more understandable for a Jewish family that's been part of the diaspora than it is for almost any other family in the context of generational trauma. I remember being told about families who'd fled the Holocaust and parents and grandparents who would keep liquid assets to hand in case they ever had to, the old adage about having a suitcase packed. And that's to flee, that's not to go home, that's to move to the next place of safety. But the notion of wanting to go home, this is an odd question for me to ask you, but how did this conversation on the radio reach your ears? Because it's simultaneously blindingly obvious that the massive majority, if not almost all refugees, would much rather go home. And yet, to the best of my knowledge, it's almost entirely absent from conversations about asylum and refugees.
Oh, it's completely absent because I think the majority of people understand, or rather label refugees as, economic migrants. They think that people leave for better opportunities. And yes, you have those people. And I would say that they're about maybe 8 to 10% of people who leave. They leave for better opportunity. But, sometimes better opportunity means not living with famine or not living with, environmental disasters. And fine, you're moving to a country which might not have those problems that have healthcare. But, a big majority, they leave because they can't survive in the situation where they're at. But sadly, it's not portrayed this way in the media. You see
even in the
plastered with
I mean
swarms of people coming into the
and you can tell from my voice that there's embarrassment attached to where I am now, because it's also, I would say, in the media that is not rabidly opposed to every refugee and asylum seeker and immigrant on the planet. Even we have failed to acknowledge this element of the conversation, which is perhaps why this footage from Syria has been so striking. I can't remember the last time. I'm sure that people will give me examples, but they haven't yet. I think the Greeks would say "isodus" as the opposite of exodus. I'm not sure, but I've never seen everyone rushing back in again as opposed to fleeing and rushing out. So it's extraordinary to see.
But I think also it hasn't been highlighted. I mean, what does Syria look like today? Like, what are they coming back to is the problem, and these people who have taken over, who are they? So it's wonderful, and I love seeing these images of Syrians coming home, because I've met a lot of Syrians who have prayed for this day, but what they're coming home to, sadly, we don't know.
No, but we do know, and that was why yesterday's phone-in was so interesting. We do know that the trappings of stability are in place, albeit that they were underpinned by absolutely hideous, an absolutely hideous regime and an appalling oppression. The trappings of a comfortable, people were leading comfortable lives as long as they never, ever, ever, ever said boo to any government goose. Elsa, thank you. It's 10:32. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Refugees want to go home. Question number one, what's that like, if that is the experience in your family, either you directly or your parents, and to know that is true? Question number two, if you want to have a crack at this, how have we allowed this element of the conversation to go almost entirely unremarked? How have we, and I'm saying we, if you're not in this category, my apologies, but there's lots of people in this category who I don't particularly want to share airspace with. How have we ended up not remembering, recognising or realising that the massive majority of refugees want nothing more than to go home? It's 10:32. Jenny Barsby has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
35 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Syria's new government announces that it will be investigating Assad's regime. Torturers and other facilitators of massive oppression, epic oppression, will be facing the music. And of course, big questions over what happens in countries like this, countries to which people fleeing Assad's regime have subsequently fled. David Lammy, I think, announced yesterday a sort of freezing of the asylum process, which seems reasonable at first glance, given that the thing that is being fled is no more. But I'm sorry to obsess about this. You know what it is like on this program, if you listen even vaguely regularly, that when a penny drops hard, I can't take my eyes off it. I can't stop hearing the echoes. How have we managed to reach the 10th of December 2024 in a country where it sometimes feels as if public discourse has really contemplated nothing but immigration since, I don't know, the early years of the last decade? And the Tory party started tearing itself to shreds because the racists were getting louder and noisier. And even in some cases, Tories were defecting to the racists. How have we managed to get to 2024 in a state where the simple statement that most refugees want to go home surprises us, staggers us, stuns us, shocks us? And yet, of course, if you grew up in that kind of family or you work in that kind of world, you're not going to be shocked at all. It took the two things. It took the visual image of the convoys of cars making their way back into Damascus and the line in the Telegraph coverage this morning, but it's everywhere, that the new administration has thrown open the borders for returning refugees, securing the knowledge that there will be thousands and thousands of them. So how did we end up in a place where we never took that bit of the conversation into our own considerations? It's crazy, right? Absolutely crazy. If you're just joining us, the key question this morning is, what's it like? What is it like to be making a life somewhere like this, or our first caller, Carlos, in Germany, as a refugee or an asylum seeker, to be doing your best to build a life, to put down roots of sorts, while simultaneously dreaming of the day when you can go home. Because for the massive, massive majority of us, we've got no grasp, no inkling of what that would be like. 10:37 is the time. I've got some very interesting Rupert Murdoch news for you as well, while we're talking about people being conditioned into hating migrants. And a couple of people crossed with me for suggesting that they've been conditioned into hating migrants and refugees, as if they object to being described as being so malleable and gullible, by which I presume you mean that you were born that way. You literally were born that way. You didn't get told or encouraged to go down this route of negativity. It was something that was biologically present from the moment of your birth, which is quite an odd admission, but there we go. 10:38 is the time. Back to the phones. Tony is in Peckham. Tony, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi, James. Firstly, thank you very much for having this discussion. I think it's a really important one, and I'm glad I was listening. Just to give a tiny bit of background, I used to be a cop in the UK, specialising in investigating human trafficking and people smuggling, and now I'm an international advisor for various different agencies around the world, particularly in East Africa.
Wow.
So I deal with a lot of smuggling routes, or we investigate a lot of those people smugglers and those being smuggled, and where it converges also into human trafficking, so those that are moved into exploitation, whether they knew that was going to be the case or not.
Yes. Well, do you know, that's another... You're going to have plenty of time, don't worry, so indulge my interruptions, because that's another element of the conversation that is not overlooked as much as the one we're having today, but that bit of it about the number of people who get filed under negative, who get demonised by the hotel burners and their friends in politics. An awful lot of them are victims. They are genuine victims of the worst kinds of exploitation and abuses.
Yeah, quite right. I mean, I think what generally happens, particularly in the UK, if I may say, is the two get confused. People smuggling or smuggling and human trafficking. Yes. So those that wish to be smuggled wish to cross an international border from point A to point B, and they need somebody to help facilitate that. So they will pay or give all other material benefit to an individual or an organisation in order to move them across that border, at which point that contract, that agreement ends. What they don't know is that actually that smuggler wishes to exploit them in town B, country B, etc. So they take that journey, they pay knowing that they're going to enter illegally. However, what they don't know is the nature of the exploitation that's going to happen to them in the end. And that's where the two conflate. What we'll often see is in countries such as Syria and others where there are major, what we refer to as push factors. So that might be political oppression, restriction of freedom of speech, sexuality, etc. Those kind of things might make that country a hostile environment for that individual or for the mass population. So you'll see a huge exodus. When it comes to things like people going for economic reasons, going to another country in the hope that they can earn more money, remit to their families back home, that's a slightly different thing.
Of course.
So when we see those people who arrive and claim asylum, in my experience, you've got those that are doing so because they have no other choice. They have left their country because of, reasons I've mentioned before, like the Syria situation. So to me, those that are going back to Syria now, I mean, like you're saying, what a wonderful scene to see is that people are going back to the country where they're born and their parents were born, and to sort of re-establish that.
Have you seen pictures?
Have
you seen pictures like that before? I mean, the Kosovan experience is comparable, but I think it was a trickle, wasn't it? I don't know that there was this moment of almost like you're driving down a road at 100 miles an hour and you do a U-turn and start driving back at 100 miles an hour in the opposite. I don't remember seeing the imagery in quite such a striking way.
I haven't honestly seen it. And like you're saying, I mean, what's the word for it? Yeah. And when we saw with Afghanistan, when the Americans pulling out not that long ago, we saw people running down runways, trying to jump on planes to get out. And now we're seeing in Syria, when it's being opened up again, people trying to return. And I think that's a wonderful thing to see. And I think it counters the narrative that particularly in the West or the global North that we have around why people leave their countries to come to the UK, the States, to Europe. It's not just one case. Everyone has their own story, and not everyone leaves for one particular reason that, is purely around economics. It's not. A lot of people, many people that I've met and many people that people like myself work with, is that they leave because they have to, and there's no other choice.
And we can't put a number on this, but clearly the proportion of people who dream, however realistic that dream may be or may prove to be, the number of refugees and asylum seekers who dream of going home is, well, two things have occurred to me this morning. It's going to be huge, and it is and has been almost entirely absent from the broader conversations.
Yeah, certainly.
I've got to pause. I said I wouldn't, but I have to because I've got to go. I've got to cross live to Tel Aviv now, Tony. We'll talk again. If it wasn't an urgent moment, you'd get a Ray Liotta, but you can keep it in the bank for the next time we talk. 10:43 is the time. Noga Tarnapolsky, who is a freelance journalist, as you know, in Tel Aviv, is in court today, where Benjamin Netanyahu is set to, or possibly already started, giving evidence in his own corruption trial, a trial that some people have argued. The postponement of which may have in some way informed some of his decisions and policies since the October the 7th terror attack upon Israel. But Noga, as ever, is here to talk us through the details and the salient points. Noga, what's going on?
Hello. Well, it's a bit of a publicity circus here. Netanyahu came surrounded with, I would say, his loudest ministers. It's a bit of a circus of support. One even lashed out at the judges who objected. And Netanyahu did, in fact, just start his testimony an hour ago or so. But we haven't really got to any substance. So for now, he's being questioned by his own attorney, very gentle questioning. And the thrust seems to be for him to show that he is such an important global leader that it is absurd that anyone could have the gall to accuse him of any corruption and then to mock the charges. He hasn't responded with any substance, but just to say, you know, I can't even finish a cigar, which I'd love to. If I was a free man, I would. But so busy am I as prime minister, I can't even enjoy a cigar, and I don't even like champagne. And he's poo-pooing the whole thing. And this is very much an opening day. His lawyer presented an overview of what their defense will be. But it has been odd to hear Netanyahu, for example, take a full 15 minutes to lash out against former President Barack Obama when asked how come he's so busy. He was so busy at the time he was being investigated, he could not possibly have engaged in corruption. And so he responded by talking about how awful President Obama was, that he had to deal with him all the time.
Gosh. For people who don't know, I should explain the references to cigars and champagne include allegations that he accepted tens of thousands of dollars worth of both from a billionaire Hollywood producer in exchange for assisting him with personal and business interests and of promoting advantageous regulation for media moguls in exchange for favourable coverage of himself and his family, singular. So the allegations are serious, but it seems that his opening salvo is to pretend that they're not.
That's exactly right. His opening salvo was to attack the media as basically a treasonous bunch who fill the public space with lies.
This, to be clear, Noga, sorry, this is Israeli media that we're talking about.
This is Israeli media we're talking about, absolutely. The same media that, as we saw during much of this year, really does fill the Israeli public space with his arguments and with, advances his own political interests.
Crucially, under Israeli law, indicted prime ministers are not required to step down. What is the sort of public opinion on? I mean, is it going to work? I'm not asking you to look in your crystal ball, but the distraction tactics, as you pointed out, he's had a hell of a lot of help over the last year with different kinds of distraction tactics. Do you think they will work in this case?
Well, I don't know how much attention the public at large is going to pay to this event today. I did speak with a prominent legal analyst just now when we left for break, and he said that what we're seeing for now is just kind of a publicity show, that we haven't begun to even touch on any of the actual legal matters. I would just like to add to what you said before about the charges, that it's even one step worse. So Netanyahu is accused of having demanded gifts, not only the cigars and champagne, but millions of dollars of a regulatory advancement for a friend of his, jewelry for his wife, of having demanded these. And as you said, in exchange for benefiting himself and his cronies.
What I appreciate you've got to get back into court. What are the?
Yeah, I do.
What final question? What sort of sentences are possible if and when the case actually reaches a proper conclusion?
Well, I mean, even just one of the charges against him, it carries a 10-year prison sentence. It's at this point, we're obviously very far away from anything like that. And Netanyahu, at any point, we should add, has the opportunity to go for a plea deal. That would imply his accepting responsibility and leaving public life, but that possibility does exist.
Noga Tarnapolsky, we will detain you no longer. Many thanks indeed. And the importance of this story in the context of the bigger picture, of course, something that will be pored over for years to come. If Netanyahu hadn't been facing these extremely serious and indeed imprisonable charges, potentially imprisonable charges, would he have pursued the path that he has pursued in the Gaza Strip and subsequently, of course, in Lebanon? Interesting that the Israeli media now is supposed to be somehow part of a conspiracy against him. It's very Trumpish in some ways, isn't it? Albeit that the allegations levelled at Donald Trump have gone through court, and he was, of course, found guilty. It is 10:48.
James O'Brien on LBC.
11 is the time, and I think you have to take your medicine, don't you, on occasions. This is from Laura. Dear James, I have a theatre company that platforms migrants and refugees. I know why you and a lot of people in this country have completely missed the fact that most refugees want to go home. It's because the conversation is always about refugees. It is never with refugees. The moment you create a space where refugees feel welcome, not only to talk, but to lead the conversation, and you are there to listen rather than imposing a frame, you immediately understand what the reality is. But the reality of refugees' lives and feelings doesn't fit the media narrative. It doesn't fit the idea that they are others from countries different from ours, with experiences that we would never face. So, of course, it's easy to think that they would only want to stay here because we are so much better. I'm sorry to say, but not understanding that refugees want to go back comes from an incredibly patronising and colonial attitude that is present even in well-meaning people like yourself. I don't think I can argue with that. And I've got no excuse, because the word that's missing is permanence. So I have a friend who is a Syrian refugee. I have more than one, actually, but I've not had this conversation with them. Hassan Akkar will join us at about 11:45 today. You may have heard my full disclosure interview with him during lockdown, where he described, I mentioned him yesterday, he's gone on to be a very powerful activist and filmmaker and campaigner. He also, because I think this matters, worked as a cleaner in NHS hospitals during the pandemic. But the question of permanence, the conflation of refugee with permanence, like a permanent refugee status, when the polar opposite is true. It's bizarre, isn't it? And of course, the more you talk about it, the less bizarre it becomes. Peter is in Beaconsfield. Peter, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Hi.
Hello.
Peter is not my real name, because
Okay.
you'll realise when I start talking. I might sound like a Peter, but I'm not. So, my family's been here for 46 years, 47 years, and we came from Libya in the mid-70s, when Gaddafi kind of nationalised everything in the mid-70s and went a bit crazy. What I want to give you perspective on is, in fact, that time is very interesting, because, the way I'm thinking about it and presenting it to you and everyone listening is almost like a graph, a maths graph, right? So if you look on the left side of the graph, you have a country which is stable, and it doesn't have to be rich.
Sure.
All humans, we want to live somewhere where it's safe for us and for our children. It doesn't have to be pretty or beautiful,
Yes.
or rich.
I grew up in Kidderminster. I know exactly what you're talking about.
Okay, all right. Okay. So, let's use Syria as an example, right? I would guess that in the 80s or 90s, nobody in Syria, very, very few people would want to leave Syria. Syria was a very nice place. I've been to Damascus a few times when I was younger. It was a very nice place. So the graph on the left side is at zero. No one in Syria wanted to be a refugee or leave the country. Very beautiful place, historical place. And then the problems start when I'm not saying everyone. Like your analyst a few calls ago said, Everyone has their own story. So not all stories are like this, but I would say the majority of stories are like the one I'm going to present to you, which is also my story.
Go on.
Which is when someone messes with a country. I mean, the French are responsible for a lot of the history and the screw-ups in history in Syria. But when you start messing with the country and make it unsafe or make it unstable, you create a problem where individuals, and not all individuals, but many individuals want to leave that country. So that graph goes from 0 people wanting to leave to some people wanting to leave, 5%, 10% of people wanting to leave, and maybe 2 or 3% make it to wherever they're trying to get to. So this whole, I would say the majority of the current situation in the UK, if you look at refugees from Afghanistan or from Ethiopia or from Syria, these issues one can trace back to 9/11, for example.
Yes.
Right. Let's bomb a country that was not a region that was not involved in 9/11. So Iraq was not involved in 9/11, nor was Iran. Let's bomb that whole region and destabilize it and cause it to become unstable. I think one thing which is forgotten is interference always has consequences. You can't just say, well, we're going to interfere. Even now, even today, right now,
and then wash our hands of it.
Exactly.
Just conscious of the time. I just want to nudge you to. I want to nudge you to your personal experience, if I may. And so, were you born in the 70s when your family came here?
In the early 70s, yes.
So
I'm.
Do you have a sense of dislocation, or do you feel? I mean, it's interesting that you say I may sound like a Peter, but I'm not a Peter.
Yeah. I was going to draw my graph further for you because I think
I am going to run out of time. That's the only reason I'm hurrying you along a bit.
It's not a curved graph, it's a step. So you reach a point after you've been here 10, 15 years and you have children.
Yes.
The graph goes from, yes, want to go back, but after 15, 20 years, it becomes improbable.
And it's a country you don't know. I mean, it's a country that doesn't exist in the sense of the country that your family fled. But there's still a sense. What does the word home mean to you then?
Home is England.
Right.
Home is England in every way.
And if Libya were to be restored to...
it's too late now, James.
It's too late for you. And are your parents still with us, if you don't mind me asking?
Yes.
What does home mean to them? What does home mean to them?
Home is England. We are
for them as well.
Patriotic, and we're Muslims. We're patriotic. We love the UK. We love England. But we're conscious of raising our voices to guide policy. Interference always has consequences, so we have to be careful not to keep interfering.
Yeah, no, I mean, parapets. You're talking about parapets and the dangers of putting your head above them in some ways. Peter, thank you. I did just want to squeeze in one more because it's an experience that I think is very pertinent to the conversation that we're having and one that has, in many ways, for many people, unfolded in plain sight. Marie's in Bishop Stortford. Marie, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, good morning, James.
Hello, Marie.
It's just interesting. These are conversations that we have at home so much over the years. So my family came over from Cyprus in the 70s. In fact, it's 50 years this year.
Gosh.
And it's kind of just been part of, even though I was born here.
This was after the Turkish invasion of Cyprus.
That's right, yes. So my family are originally from the north, which is the occupied part. And it's been in the fabric of our life, of our being throughout my life. It's just been there, and it's part of who I am even. And
so, I mean, for people who don't know, there are buildings in Turkish occupied Cyprus that would have been fled by families like yours.
Yes, absolutely.
Literally walked out the door with everything you could carry and never went back.
With nothing but the shirt on her back my mum came over here with. Oh. And the reason why they settled here is because we did have family here.
Yes.
So it made sense for them too. And they've actually visited, it was my grandparents' farm and houses. They've been back there. There's family living there now. And when they went back to visit, they'd actually kept things like photographs and things because they knew that the people that had lived there before might come back someday. And for 30 years or more, 30, 40 years, they'd kept hold of these things. Because these people are displaced too. The people that are occupying my grandparents' home would have been displaced from elsewhere. I'm afraid I don't know all the details.
No, of course.
But it was just absolutely wonderful that they were.
And how much of it? I wouldn't ask this if you hadn't said that you have these conversations a lot. And Peter's description of a graph was really interesting because presumably when Mum and Dad first arrived here, or when your mum first arrived here, she would have thought, in some sense, that going back was on the agenda. That the Turks would be driven back out, and then at some point you come along and you've probably got siblings and settling and roots, and then that graph. This is what Peter was trying to describe. Then there comes the point where your soul yearns to return, but your body, your body's never going to.
I think for us, home is wherever a family is.
Oh, yeah.
So, and my mum's now got grandchildren.
So she's a yeah.
She's a yeah, absolutely. And she does go back to Cyprus frequently on holiday, and she'll go for months at a time, obviously, to the south.
Yes.
So she's got a home here and a home there. I think there's probably somewhere deep down she knows it won't happen, but she'd love in her lifetime to be able to go back home. And
it is her spitisu.
Yeah, exactly.
I love that. And I think the reason I wanted to squeeze you in at the end is because the passage of time from that 50th anniversary is fascinating. I don't know what the experiences was like with regard to racism and unwelcome for Greek Cypriots coming here 50 years ago, but it's become so much part of the fabric of our society that people probably don't realise. A lot of people don't realise that those stories, the stories of people like you and families like you, began with fleeing invasion, fleeing.
Well, exactly that. And I know especially the boys in our family, but I don't know why the boys in particular. Perhaps they were more sensitive to it. They used to get into scraps at school and things for being different because they spoke differently, they dressed differently, they looked different. The dark, olive skin. Yeah. But it's thankfully it's not something that we experience now. Although when we were having to apply for pre-settled status for my mother after we left the EU, that was a bit made us feel a bit,
because she'd never got around to it, because she'd never needed to before.
Well, no, exactly. But then that kind of made her feel othered again, because she's been living here for 50 years. She's brought up 3 children. She's worked, paid off her mortgage, and then all of a sudden she's having to dig through.
You don't really belong. That message that you don't really,
exactly.
and it's not enough to say, yeah, you do. Just fill in the paperwork, you'll be fine. And a lot of people will be hearing echoes of Windrush, of course, in what you describe, and it is there. It does speak to an impermanence, a duality, a fragility of existence that the rest of us, if we haven't grown up in families like yours, are probably not conscious of or don't think about enough. Murray, thank you. Thank you. That was an amazing hour. I hope it's reached parts that I've failed to reach before, because I hadn't clocked that refugee is almost by definition a temporary status in the hearts and minds of refugees, even if the residents of the host country, the welcoming or unwelcoming country, are increasingly conditioned by media and politicians to see it at best as permanent and at worst as dishonest.
James O'Brien on LBC.
6 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm going to read you this message in its entirety, and we can see it as a comma or a semicolon in the conversation about asylum and refugees prompted by the extraordinary scenes in Syria, and also we need to keep an eye on these continuing Israeli movements and bombardments in Syrian territory. The UN Special Envoy to Syria calling this morning for this to stop, but we have had something of a crash course over the course of the last year in Benjamin Netanyahu's attitude to international law and indeed international pleas to stop pursuing certain courses in this conflict. So that is very much a watching brief, but this is of an altogether different order. This is from Beatrice, who I've met actually, as you'll see. Hi James, I met you when you did your book show at the Glee Club in Birmingham. I remember, and I'll tell you why I remember at the end of this message. After a year in prison during Pinochet's dictatorship in Chile, I was grateful to the British government at the time for the offer of a visa to come to the UK as a refugee. I was only 23 years old. At the age of 72 now, I have always felt torn apart and extremely sad as I've missed births, weddings, funerals of family and friends in Chile. I've missed waking up and seeing the Andes each day. I miss the food, the Pacific Ocean, the desert and the Antarctic. But as the dictatorship lasted so long, by the time I was allowed to go back, I had my family here. And although they're happy to go to Chile to visit relatives and to see the country, their lives are here. Hence mine has to be here too, with the tremendous pain of the knowledge that I will die one day feeling torn apart. And that is the refugee experience for people who do stay and do not go home. That's a really powerful message. And forgive me if I've misremembered, Beatrice, but I think it was you that educated me about the use of the word America. I hope you've noticed I've tried very, very hard to talk about the United States of America or the USA and to stop using America as a synonym for one country that is part of the Americas, that is part of that continent. I don't always do it. I'm fully conscious of failing, but I hope you've noticed that I'm trying. I really do, because that's all on you. That was entirely as a consequence of your explanation and request that I've tried to do that. Speaking about changing your mind or having enough curiosity about the world to want to change your mind. We touched on it a bit yesterday, didn't we? The observation about a character type that we're all susceptible to that says we didn't have that when I was growing up, or we didn't have that when I was young, therefore it must all be nonsense. And you can file lots of stuff under that. Health and safety legislation, human rights legislation, which of course was there and did exist, but wasn't as politically live as it is now. And then the little stuff as well, you know. I don't know that. We didn't have that when I was young. Why do you need a diversity officer? Why do you need HR? Why do you need human resources? We didn't have that when I was young. You didn't have that when they were sending kids up chimneys. And there is actually a relationship between the two phenomena. But some people lack the curiosity or the concern to care enough to find out. And this is a really classic example of that. There's a story today about the financial burden that local authorities face as a consequence of helping children with special educational needs. Most obviously, in the way the story is reported today, autism and ADHD. Indeed, so acute is the financial responsibility here that it could contribute to widespread bankruptcies across local councils. They describe a rapid rise in children being formally assessed as having special educational needs and disabilities. You're looking, I think, at about 5% of children now falling into that category, which is an exponential increase on previous years. But remember, when I was at school, dyslexia was new. When I was at school, when I started school in 1970, well, I suppose I started school in 1975, but by the time I got to proper school, if you like, in about 1979, started studying proper academic subjects, dyslexia was not really a thing. And this was in the private sector, where lots of people who don't want to pay VAT on school fees insist you have to go in order to have your children's needs catered for. The reason I mentioned dyslexia is because I don't think, and I'm not even sure, I want you to correct me if I'm wrong, I don't think anybody disputes the reality of dyslexia anymore. I had conversations a few years ago with people of a certain age who were going through the education system at a time when dyslexia was not recognised or not understood. And they end up illiterate in large part. We took calls from grown men and women who are, particularly men, maybe more likely to ring in or more likely to fall through the cracks of the education system because more likely to play up. But I don't want to generalise. We took calls from people who had been completely left alone by the education system. They'd sort of sit in the back of the classroom looking out the window and do nothing. And I think dyslexia is the perfect gateway for this conversation. And the reason I've filed it under health and safety, human rights, HR, or whatever else it is going to be, diversity and inclusion officers, is it's another thing that people like to respond to by saying, well, it didn't exist when I was young, so I don't know why we're all talking. We called it naughty in my day. That kind of attitude, which again, I've got a horrible feeling I suffered from in my early days doing this job. It's weird, that, isn't it? You think something's changed in society. And yet, as soon as I dangled dyslexia in front of you, you go, crikey, he's right. There were kids at I don't know how old you'd have to be, sort of 50s, 60s, 70s, to think, God, of course that kid was dyslexic. And nobody really knew what that meant at the time. And of course there'll be people listening to this now going, well, of course I am. Of course I am. And of course I should have been treated differently in school, but I wasn't. But it's not dyslexia that we're going to talk about today. Although, you can, but it's not my entry point on this. It's the Institute of Fiscal Studies, which is warning about the cost of meeting special educational needs. It's another thing that gets filed under spend the money now and save a fortune in the long run, because if these children are looked after, then they will do much better and therefore lead more fulfilling and productive lives, and therefore cost less money to society in the future. If you look at illiteracy levels, and if indeed you look at issues like ADHD among the prison population, you'll understand what I'm talking about. And that's just a small piece of the jigsaw. But the requirement also to support children until they turn 25 in a tiny, tiny proportion of cases will appear in the news coverage today. So here's how we're going to do it, all right? I'm always a little bit conscious of telling you not to ring in, but this is not a conversation about your children, okay? This is a conversation about you. And this is a conversation about the ADHD or the autism equivalent of dyslexia. So because of increased diagnostic ability, because of the advancement of the science, because of a huge increase in awareness and understanding, many, many, many more children today will be diagnosed with ADHD and autism and OCD and other issues that barely had names when you were growing up. This conversation is inspired partly by the number of adults who got in touch with me to say they got their diagnosis for ADHD and for autism when their children did. So because you can now go to places that your mum and dad couldn't go to. You can consult somebody that your mum and dad couldn't consult. You were called naughty. You were called lazy. You were called thick. You were called uncontrollable. You were called delinquent. But you were none of those things. You were living with ADHD and or autism. So what I want to try to do, and it's a new way into this topic, because it's not a conversation about your children, it's a conversation about you. I want to know what happened before we started diagnosing these conditions. This is almost like the yin to the yang of saying, oh, they're all naughty. We just called it naughty in my day. I don't know what they're going on about. Speaking of people who lack the curiosity or the intelligence to understand just how stupid they are. Do you know why I'm getting lots of messages? Let me read you one. I'll do this as a little bit of a teaser. Why is Stu sending me a message saying, if you don't mention the Battle of the Somme this morning, I'll eat my gas mask? Do you know why? Why is Stu sending me messages about the Battle of the Somme? And why did that just spring into my mind when we were talking about professionally stupid people? I may reveal a little more later. But in the meantime, speaking of stupid, people who were called stupid, who were described as stupid, but who were not, and you didn't know until you woke up one day living in a country where neurodiversity was properly recognized, where autism and ADHD were much better understood. So what Timothy's been in touch to say, James, how on earth did you get hold of my school report? Could have been my school report as well, actually, and I'm never quite sure where I sit on the ADHD scale. But the question of, obviously, I've done all right. I wasn't abandoned by the education system or didn't slip through any nets, but you did. So you now know either you're certain because you looked into it, or you've actually had a diagnosis. You now know that if you had been at school today, you would have been one of these children diagnosed with ADHD or with autism or something else. So what I want to know is what happened instead. So in a world where, in an education system, in a classroom where no one really knew what ADHD or autism was. And remember that we've done this with dyslexia, which is the perfect example if there's any skepticism, any latent skepticism out there about the reality of this. What was it like to be at school in a classroom when nobody really knew what ADHD or autism was? The number of adults who go public, famous people who go public with an autism diagnosis, I think is really powerful and very relevant to the conversation that we're having. So how liberating is it to get a name for what you felt had always marked you out as difficult? The masking is a huge part of it. Bruce has been in touch to say autism gives you the ability to hold it together while you're falling apart until it doesn't, Bruce. Am I right? That's called masking. And the effort, the physical and mental effort that you put into appearing, quotes, normal, end quotes, can cause you enormous trauma, enormous difficulty. But if you are diagnosed and you are receiving help, the masking becomes the masking is dealt with. It's in large part addressed. So I want people who didn't have diagnoses because they didn't exist when they were at school to tell us what it was like having subsequently realized that you have a neurodiverse condition. Having subsequently realized that you have it, what was it like to be educated in a world where nobody really knew it existed? And if they did, they didn't really understand it. All right? Hit the numbers now. You will get through. And I think actually a few of you suggesting we should include dyslexia. And do you know what? You're right. So as well, when you were at school, dyslexia wasn't a thing. Looking back, you can only imagine how different your life would have been if that had been recognised and addressed when you were a nipper. 11:19 is the time. The number you need is 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 20 minutes after 11. This is exactly what we're talking about from, I'm not going to be able to find it. Yes, I am, from Sebastian. I was just sent out to stand in the hall, James. I was once made to sit facing a wall for a whole term by the teacher. Jason writes, I was diagnosed as being hyperactive in the 1980s, James, which I guess would have been classed as ADHD these days. I also have 3 sons with a mix of autism and ADHD. My dad was dyslexic, always classed as thick at school, but he was amazing at fixing things, so he got by. And that notion of what is different now, because some people profess to be baffled, and some people I think truly are. Baffled by the exponential increase in diagnoses. And there may be some misdiagnosis and overdiagnosis, but that is never the story. The story is always the people who need help. It is a particularly pungent brand of journalism that seeks to direct you towards the people who might not, as the most important element of a conversation about people who really, really do. But the numbers are so striking that it makes it worthwhile to ask what used to happen. Connor is in, this is good for fans of alliteration. Connor is in Cockermouth in Cumbria. Connor, what would you like to say?
Yeah, I personally was thrown out of high school come year 10. And then since then, I've had a diagnosis of dyslexia with ADHD. Right. And with that help and support, I'm now in my final year of a law degree. So essentially that means that without that support, I left school essentially illiterate.
And with behavioural, I mean, you were thrown out for your behaviour, presumably, were you?
Definitely.
I like that cheeky giggle at the end, and then fair play to you, because it's hardly your fault if you weren't engaging in a education system that hadn't recognised what you needed to engage in. But I mean, what happened to make you? Did you always feel that there was a missing piece of your personal jigsaw?
Well, people always said I was intelligent, yes. But people always said that when it comes to work and putting the work in, Connor doesn't want to do it. Connor's lazy. Connor, so I ended up getting into arguments with teachers constantly, and yes. I was perhaps the most hated student by the teachers at the school.
Because they thought you were playing up and doing all this through choice and refusing to engage and indulging in your laziness, whereas in fact your brain just wasn't wired in a way that allowed you to do the things that the other kids could do quite easily.
And definitely, and every employer that I've had since has said I've been an absolute asset to the team. It just seems that in educational context, it didn't work out.
Good Lord. What changed? What did the kind of treatment involve? What are the things that could have been done when you were 11, but instead were done when you were in your 20s?
It's burnout. So if you're sat in a classroom and you're concentrating on something for more than 20 minutes, you burn out, and you can't do it. And so what you end up doing is messing with your mates or looking elsewhere, looking out the window. And the treatment for that has been software on my own computer and having my own time to work at my own leisure.
And are you medicated at all? If you don't mind me asking, you don't have to tell me.
I've chosen not to do that because I believe I've got to nearly 30 in life without being medicated. Yeah. I found alternative therapy solutions rather than having to dose up, if you will.
No, I mean, I understand your position, although it can be an absolute lifesaver for some people. But behaviour, medicine, treatment, as you say, therapy, all of these things just create, what is it? It gives you a gear that's always been there, but which you haven't been able to move into before.
Yeah, for sure. And now I'm enjoying education, and I'm really enjoying it, and I'm learning a lot.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by the short-term expenditure for the long-term gain. So, you know, whatever Connor does with his law degree, it is likely to be to the benefit of society, and he is likely to be of more benefit to society and to be living a happier life than if he'd stayed on the path he was on when he got slung out of school in year 10. Great statistic someone's just shared with me. Jack has just shared with me. What do you think? What percentage of the population is left-handed? Go on, have a guess. These are American figures, but I don't know why they'd be any different in this country. About 12% of the population is left-handed. But if you were to go back to 1910, what percentage of the population do you think was left-handed in 1910? 3. So what on earth happened between 1910 and 1960 when the figure hit roughly 12%, where it has stayed ever since? Yeah, exactly. Diagnosis. At which point a Daily Mail columnist can write an article about overdiagnosis of left-hander. There weren't that many left-handed people around when I was a kid. Yeah, and also, you know, if you used your left hand, you get smacked by a ruler until you started using your right hand. They used to tie my hand behind my back. There's no such thing as left-handedness. You just need to have your left hand tied behind your back for a while so you learn to use your right hand. I'm not even exaggerating. That's the same story. If I come on the radio 15 years ago and go, oh, come off it. Left-handedness. We had some kids at my school who thought they were left-handed. Not for long, I can tell you. Oh, I can tell you. Mr. Jones soon dealt with them with his special magic handcuffs. But there it is. There's the figure. For reasons I don't understand, it was at 5% in 1890, and it went down to 3% in 1910, and then it just shot up when people started recognising it and diagnosing it, if that's the right word to use, people acknowledging it. James is in Hull. James, what made you pick up the phone?
Yeah, hi there. Well, I was diagnosed when I was 42, so 10 years ago, so I'm the same age as you.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, I went through school, was similar to what the other guy said about just not concentrating, is bright, but doesn't want to work.
Doesn't want to work. Chooses to be like this. Always, isn't it?
Yes. It's always chooses, yeah. And I would say the real problems started about 13, 14. And I just didn't understand social cues.
Yeah.
And that becomes really difficult at that age. In
what way, James?
I hadn't realised.
What sort of things are we talking about? You just would draw attention to yourself for all the wrong reasons.
Just no filter.
No filter.
So just blurt out. I mean, if I thought the teacher was stupid, I'd say, which is then why I got suspended.
Right. Which compromises your education, which means you're further behind, which means you get more distracted, which means you misbehave more next time you're back in class.
Yeah, it's and it wasn't really until the National Autistic Society got involved, and I hadn't realised I'd had multiple breakdowns at work, and had to leave. Yeah, it's
because you were masking, because the mental strain of trying to keep a lid upon your reactions was so great. Is that why you think we had breakdowns? Because you're trying so hard I think they call it masking, don't they?
Masking, yeah.
And that must be
Girls
exhausting.
are better at masking than it is. Yeah, I mean, quite often I have a nap in the afternoon.
Yeah.
Too much to my parents' laughter, but my wife understands. Probably the only person that really understands.
Oh.
what it's like.
And what happened? What was the final push that made you seek a diagnosis? You mentioned the society. What made you do it, and what was it like? Go on.
My wife worked with someone whose husband was, and she was talking to her, and she said, "Is your husband got Asperger's?" Well, they call it Asperger's now, but it's basically high functioning autism.
Right.
And we went to the doctor, and the first doctor, GP, just said, no, you can make eye contact. You haven't got autism, which obviously is ignorance. We went for a second opinion, and then, they just go through I can't remember if it's psychologist or psychologist.
Sure. Yeah.
And then they referred me to the class clinic in Cambridge.
And it worked. And how quickly did you? I mean, what was it?
Yeah.
What was the experience of treatment like? How much did it change for you, life-wise?
Well, the thing is, unfortunately, with adults with autism, when you get your diagnosis, it's bye-bye.
Right.
That's it, really. There's not really... Our society sort of forgets that a child with autism grows up to be an adult with autism.
Yes.
It doesn't change when you get to 18. You're exactly the same.
But life with the diagnosis is better than life without, surely.
Yes, completely.
Why?
Completely, yeah. Because you now understand.
Yeah.
You understand why.
Yeah.
You felt different. Why you used to do these things? Why, when people used to say, "Why can't you just do that? Why can't you just be normal? Why can't you?"
And all think now, and people will be thinking of you. People who are at school with you. Crikey, there was that lad at school, or there were those kids at school who were in the category that you describe, and that's why having the conversation from this end of the telescope is, I hope, so helpful, because we were all there. Whether you were that child like James, and possibly, like you, who knows, or whether you can just now remember the kid that you really liked because they were always making you laugh and they were naughty and they were always cheeking the teacher, but they weren't doing themselves any favours. And now at 11:31 on Tuesday, the 10th of December, I finally understood why teachers write on reports they're laughing at him. They're not laughing with him. And that's part of the problem that we're describing, right? Because they might have been laughing at him, but he thought they were laughing with him. And the reason why he was doing the things that made them laugh was because of neurodiversity, not because of naughtiness or some sort of innate delinquency. Wow. James, thank you. It's 11:31. Jenny Barsby has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
6 minutes to 12. I think that my little routine about left-handedness may have landed slightly wrong in some people's ears. I know that it was bullied out of you. That's why I thought the statistics spoke for itself. I'm getting quite a lot of messages saying, I know why the figures have gone up. I do too. And because people did tie your hand behind the back, or people did bully you into using your right hand. So it didn't stop you being left-handed. You were still left-handed. You'd just been conditioned into thinking that you weren't, or favouring your right hand by conditioning. So that's why it's relevant to the conversation that we're having about neurodiversity. Why has the figures gone up by so much? Well, why did the figures for left-handed people go up exponentially in America between 1910 and 1960? Because we stopped bullying. That's where the word sinister comes from. And that goes back to the Romans. Sinister is a synonym for dodgy, right? And it is literally the Latin word for left. So there was just something probably religious at some point, suspect about left-handedness, the othering of the left-handers. So that's why. So thank you for telling me about what happened to you as a child when people still tried to kind of squeeze the left-handedness out of you. But I did understand that, and I didn't perhaps make it entirely clear why I was citing it in reference to this conversation that we're having. Although there is no confusion at all, it would seem, about why you are... why many of you began the programme this morning convinced that I would make reference to the Battle of the Somme. And I'm going to tell you why. So a young woman on social media wrote, "Women deal with periods, pregnancy and menopause. What do men have to deal with?" Which is one of those questions that resonates, because you sort of think, well, if men had to deal with periods, pregnancy and menopause, then I'll tell you something for nothing. There'd be no debate about abortion. There'd be much, much, much more support for menstruation in the workplace, in education, in society at large. And once you reach a certain age, which is a phrase in the news for all the wrong reasons at the moment, but once you reach a certain age, then employers, society would be required by law to make the accommodations that you need to deal with your menopause. So if the menopause actually happened to men, it would be enshrined in law as a condition in need of proper professional protection. If pregnancies happen to men, then contraception would be available on every street. Well, it kind of is actually, but it didn't used to be. And there'd be no debate at all about abortion. And if men had periods, then sanitary products would be free. So that's why it's a funny question. Funny as in, interesting. Sanitary products would be free. They'd be given away. They'd be absolute. But anyway. So 30p Lee, who may need a new nickname, genuinely, and I had to check this was true because I'm not really on Elon Musk's platform anymore. I'm on Blue Sky, which is where the screenshot appeared. But I thought, even by his standards, this might be a parody. This might be a hoax. So how on earth? Well, you tell me. So here's the original question. Women deal with periods, pregnancy and menopause. What do men have to deal with? As in, I don't think I need to explain this, do I? But as in all men, forever. So all women, for all time, have had to deal with periods, pregnancy and menopause. What might be the equivalent burden that all men for all time have to deal with? Do you want to take a moment? 30p Lee Anderson replied, try the Battle of the Somme. You can't even. So all women for all time, serious difficulties, periods, pregnancy, menopause. What's the male equivalent of that? Okay, I'll have a little think. Oh, I've got it. Try the Battle of the Somme. And but then you press send. So you write it down. This is the thing that always amazes me about these moments. You write it down. You see it on the screen, and instead of what 99.9% of the population would do and just go, how the hell did that ever appear in my brain, let alone on my phone screen, 30p Lee presses send. Yep, the Battle of the Somme is something that's happened to all men for all time. Anyway, there you go. That's why I'm not on Twitter anymore. 11:39 is the time. Back to the adult experience of conditions that didn't really have a name or certainly didn't get diagnosed when you were a child. Karine is in Glasgow. Karine, what would you like to say?
Hi.
Hello.
Well, before I mention about ADHD, just the other two comments have really resonated. So 30p Lee, how insulting. My grandpa was injured in the Battle of the Somme and lived for the next 40 years of his life with an open chest wound. However, he managed to get married and have 5 children, but Lee Fitzpatrick is just, not Lee Fitzpatrick, 30p Lee is just crazy. And the
Do you think he was there? He looks too young to me. I mean, what was it, 1916, I think?
1916 it was. My grandpa was 19.
Well, he looks well, doesn't he, for someone old enough to have been at the Battle of the Somme?
Absolutely. He has no clue. He really has no clue. And the second one was about the left-handedness, because it's funny, because my mum was naturally left-handed, but again, bullied through the 40s and 50s to be right-handed, but she did everything else. She sewed left-handed, she cut scissors, with her left hand. So
you never stopped being left-handed. You just write with your right hand because you've been bullied and in some cases like physically coerced into doing it.
She was hit. I mean, she said her teachers used to hit her with a ruler, and that was in the 40s and 50s, so it wasn't even that long ago.
So no mystery there. It's almost like today's programme was bespoke, tailored just for you, Karine. It's a very special experience. I hope you appreciate it.
I do. It did really feel like that, because just as I came in from walking the dog, I was sitting having my breakfast, and I was reading a post on LinkedIn by a chap called Lee Fitzpatrick, who is a marketing manager, and he's working with a company that's just launched a new app called Ivy.
Right.
For students, for note-taking, for people with dyslexia, ADHD, blah, blah, blah. So I'm reading this, it just was very triggering because I remembered back, I did okay at school. I get good grades, probably a bit underachieved because if I wasn't interested, I'd just get a bit bored and sort of switched off. So I didn't try as hard as I could. But unlike some of your previous callers, maybe being a girl, I don't know. I did work hard enough that I got good grades, went to university. But I remember walking in my first lecture, I studied chemistry. I walked into the lecture theatre and I've actually got a picture of it. I just Googled it because it just triggered me. Gosh. And it's 3 huge blackboards. There must have been, I don't know, 150 people in the room. And I just remember furiously trying to write notes down and thinking, oh my God, there's so much information.
Can't do it.
And I was fine at school because things were sort of more controlled. University I found really challenging because that was back, in the 80s, so we didn't have computers, we didn't have all the smart technology. We didn't even get notes handed out. You actually had to write stuff down and then follow up. So I had never failed an exam in my life, and I got 22% my first chemistry exam, and I was devastated. Of
course you were.
However, I managed to get through and got a degree, but then going into the workplace, I just struggled a lot of the time of things where things had to be very precise and had to be done a certain way. I'd lose track of conversations. I wasn't very good with deadlines, and I was working for Motorola Semiconductors, an engineering company, and needs to be precise. And I just didn't fit, and I didn't understand why. And like your previous caller, roll forward sort of 40 years, I had quite a few breakdowns recently. Women of a certain age, menopause coming in as well, and I was like, I'm cracking up.
The menopause is tough, Kareem, but it's not like you're at the Battle of the Somme.
No. Well, it might feel like it sometime, mentally.
And I'm not making light of breakdowns. Of course, I'm not. But it just becomes too much. The strain of masking or whatever the word is. And I've got to tell you, I'm getting so many messages with all the callers to say, Sandy's just been, oh my goodness, this lady is me. So many people hearing their own lives reflected back at them by these callers. So you were in your 50s then by the time you went for
I was 54, and I really hit a really bad point in my life. Everything, it was awful. Really bad.
Gosh.
And I wanted to explore what was going on. And I'm going to recommend to any of your readers that haven't read it is Gabor Mate's book called Scattered Minds. And I heard him getting interviewed on the radio, and I thought, oh, that's quite interesting. That sounds a bit like me. And it was about he works with people with trauma, so drug addicts and things like that, but then realised he had undiagnosed ADHD when his children were diagnosed. Now, he's now in his 70s or 80s. And I read this book and I went, that's me. Yeah. And I had so many things in my life. I was adopted, stuff going through school, just lots and lots of things. And it's like, this makes sense. And then the whole chemistry side of your brain chemistry, then with the menopause on top of it, I suddenly went, oh, that makes sense, because estrogen levels drop, and when we're going through the menopause, which cause your dopamine levels to drop. And so I was already having problems with the dopamine with ADHD, and then on top of it. So for me, getting a diagnosis, I had friends say to me, why do you want a diagnosis? Why do you want a label? But it was like your previous caller said, I just wanted to understand, because I honestly thought that I was cracking up.
Yeah.
So it's been great. So I get diagnosed, I'm now 58, I get diagnosed 3 years ago, and I went through a horrible period where I was beating myself up for a good year afterwards about all my underachievements. And now
for not having done it sooner, or just for not having gone
for that, but also for... sort of like the life you could have. Oh no,
better late than never.
I do know that now.
Yeah.
I know that now, but I think there was just so much of looking back and thinking, oh, I wish I'd done something, differently or whatever. But I've got through that, and now I celebrate it because I see my skill as I'm really good at joining the dots. I see connections that other people don't see. I'm really good at networking. And these are all skills that are really, really important to me. And, I'm now trying to advocate. And if I can say that, to me, ADHD, a lot of these spectrum disorders, if so many aspects of our life were on the spectrum, it could be our sexuality, it could be, all sorts of different things. So I think there's no such thing as normal. We're all diverse.
And yet, I don't know what it's like in other countries. Gabor Mate, his mother's Holocaust experiences, he attributes with a lot of his trauma and displacement theory or detachment theory.
Detachment theory,
you're right. I mean, the pressure that society puts on us to be like cookie cutter, to be uniform, to all look exactly the same, perhaps explains why perhaps the people who push back most violently against the upticks in diagnoses are the people who would actually benefit from some sort of diagnosis themselves, because you're kind of living in that state of denial and pushing it into the back of your mind. Do you? I think from the joy that you convey on the phone, Shariq's been in touch to say, please could you invite Karen back once a week to talk about whatever she likes? What a delightful caller! I invite everybody on the program once a week to talk about whatever they like. Shariq, there's no special treatment for Kareem, but I know what he means. I presume you feel much lighter. Your life is now much better.
Absolutely. And when I think, my previous experience with ADHD had been, my kids are 28 and 26, and my son had a boy in his primary class who was diagnosed. And I look back and I just think it was the environment that was wrong for him. So he was rebelling, and the reason he was creating was going, I'm bored, this doesn't suit me. So it was the environment was wrong. There's nothing wrong with him. Well,
that's a great way of putting it.
Learning to put people in an environment where they can thrive.
Again, another figure of speech that doesn't always make sense begins to make perfect sense. Because Sally got in touch with me earlier to say this is me, referring to another caller, and then went on and got a late life. I think she was 72 when she got her diagnosis, but she said, I have actually spent my whole life helping round square pegs in round holes, and that's what you're saying. As your boy was in a round hole, and he was a square peg, so there was nothing that could be done about it. One more before you go, Karine. This lady writes, Joe, is me. Diagnosed at 47 when the perimenopause hit. The mask fell away and the wheels fell off. Life's no easier post-diagnosis. Well, Karine can hopefully be a beacon for you, Joe, but she says, at least I now understand why I've made so many terrible decisions in life. And these are people with conditions that barely had a name when they were children. And yet much of the media today approaches a huge uptick in the number of children with these conditions with either a combination of skepticism and disapproval. And you have to wonder why sometimes. Karine, thank you so much. And you can come back on, talk about whatever you want, as long as it's a topic that we've already introduced.
James O'Brien on LBC.
52 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I mentioned to you earlier that one of the reasons why I was a bit embarrassed in the first hour to realise that I had fallen victim to a conflation of refugee status with permanence. And that's why the scenes of people returning joyously to Damascus in particular and to Syria in general were so moving, but also accompanied by that penny drop moment, which was, of course, almost all refugees want to go home. Certainly in the first instance, the first years, months after leaving their homes, they think of little else. We want to go home, and yet that is so absent from the debate. One of the reasons I was particularly embarrassed to realise that I'd fallen into that trap was because of Hassan Akkar, a filmmaker and writer, and, as I'm sure he won't mind me mentioning, an NHS hospital cleaner during the lockdowns, because he told me his story a few years ago on Full Disclosure, my podcast series, where you can also hear an episode with Gabor Mate, actually, who Karine was just referring to in the last call. And I should have had that more in the forefront of my mind as I watched the events unfolding over the course of the weekend. But still a timely moment to catch up with Hassan, who fled. Well, you feared for your life during the civil war. So let's begin at the end, if we will, or at least let's begin with where we are now, Hassan. How have you greeted the events and scenes in your hometown?
Hi, James. The last two nights, I still wake up in the morning, and the first thing I do is that I check my phone to check that it actually happened, because I still think it's I still don't believe that it's happened. I still don't believe that we finally, Syria has finally been liberated by Syrians from 50 years of tyranny, from 50 years of the worst dictatorship in modern history. I'm full of joy and happiness, and I can't believe that I left Damascus nearly 12 years ago, and I will be able to go back to Damascus now. I can't believe that this is. I never thought that this was going to happen in my lifetime.
A quick word then on the circumstances in which you left. As I say, there's a full account of your life story really on the Full Disclosure podcast that we did during lockdown. But I mean, your experience was a little out of the ordinary, given at one point the face-to-face encounter you had.
So in the early days of the revolution, of the uprising, before it was a civil war, it was a peaceful uprising. It was a revolution of Syrians like me who were on the streets chanting freedom as a result of the Arab Spring. Syrians who took to the streets calling for freedom and liberty and democracy. And the way that these people were treated, including myself, is that they were either killed or arrested and tortured. I was detained twice. I still bear the scars on my arms from what happened to me in detention. After my first detention, when Bashar al-Assad back then in early 2012, he wanted to present himself as this modern leader, he started meeting different segments of society. And I happened to get the chance to meet him. And I said, and those were my exact words, and God marked my word. I told him that you are fighting your people. You are detaining and torturing your people. One day you are doomed to fall. Those were my exact words. I told him, one day you're going to go. And then he smirked. He looked at me. We were in the palace. He looked at me and he said, well, we fought in the 80s. He was referencing the Hama massacre that happened in the 80s, when his father killed 40,000 people. He said, well, we fought in the 80s and we won, and we will win again. And look at him now. He fled Syria like a little rat in the dark. He fled Syria and he became the refugee that he made. Half of Syria was made refugees. 13 million Syrians, between 7 million refugees and 5 IDPs. And now he is the refugee. So I can't. It's really hard to put into words.
You're doing all right.
The feeling.
You're doing all right, Hassan. You're doing all right.
Yeah.
You always do.
Yeah,
and before we get on to your hopes for the future, a word, if you would, and I don't want any modesty here, okay? Because lots of people wouldn't have gone out onto the streets in those moments. Good people, but they wouldn't have had the courage, if that's the right word. That's why I say I don't want any modesty here. Why did you, knowing what had happened in the 80s, knowing what the new regime or newish regime was likely to emulate the old regime, why did you go out and do things that other people were being killed for doing?
I did that, James, because the videos that everyone is watching right now, they are coming out from detention of the people who've lost their minds, of the women who were raped, of the toddlers in prisons, the pictures that we're getting of body bags that are being found. Syrians knew about this for a long time. I had a cousin who was in Palmyra prison, who was there for 16 years. We know these things. Syrians know these things, and we've been telling the world for the last 12 years. This is what's happening in Syria. This is why we are fleeing Syria. We've been calling for the international community, but the international community failed Syria. Syria was failed. Fadl Abdelghani, the director of the Syrian Network for Human Rights, yesterday said, and he confirmed what none of us wanted to hear, that the 100,000 plus detainees and disappeared in Syria are killed. They have been we know that they have been killed. We never wanted none of us wanted to hear this. We were hoping the families can you imagine the 100,000 families who've been in limbo, the uncertainty, hoping that one day that they're going to be reunited with their loved ones. Now they are confirmed dead. We knew about these things. That's why we protested. That's why we went on around the world telling the world. We wrote books, we went on podcasts, we interviewed, we did everything. The Syrian society, the Syrian diaspora did everything that we can to tell the world, but the world failed us.
Because in the end, as you said at the very outset, this is by Syrians for Syrians. You will be following events more closely than almost anybody else. And obviously there are some early concerns about the past associations of the leader of the rebellion. The early signs, I think, are positive. Are you confident that they will stay positive?
Listen, the things on the ground right now are like there's a vacuum of power right now.
Yeah.
The leader, I'm telling you again, we have half a century of Assad power. So Syria isn't going to be fine in a day. Every conflict will be there. There's going to be chaos. The amount of weapons. James, I want to tell you something. The reason why he fled like this and he left. This is all on purpose, by the way. And he left the army barracks, the security branches were left open. It's because, there are thugs in every society. Because you knew that the thugs are going to come in and loot the weapons and loot the guns, which will eventually tear the fabric of Syrian society even more. I have hopes in the opposition. I have hopes in the rebels. I have hopes that they first of all they will be able to manage the amount of weapons that have been looted.
Yes.
Because of Assad and how he left it, because he didn't do a peaceful transition of power. So I have hope. What right now? What's urgent right now? What's urgent right now is that first of all, I really call on the international community to put some pressure on Israel to stop bombing Damascus. My cousins in Damascus, they told me that they have never witnessed or seen such amount of bombing since the beginning of the war. They have completely decimated the Syrian army. And listen, to argue that they don't want the weapons to fall into the wrong hands and which will affect the state of Israel, okay. But why are they bombing the security branches, James? The security branches contain documents that are very important to the Syrian society. We need these documents. We need to find the war criminals who killed our people. We need to find the war criminals, the Assad thugs who I told you killed 100,000 Syrians. I call the international community to put pressure on Israel to pull their troops out of Syria and to stop the systemic bombing of Syria that's happening right now. Second, what's also hope the international community can do, the Syrian hospitals are struggling to cope. Syria needs help on every front. Syria is a failed state. The economy has tanked. 75% of the infrastructure was destroyed. The people are it's struggling. The country, so we need help on every front. And what follows this is that we need experts to help the Syrian civil society, to help the heroes of the white helmet, who everyone, even some voices in Britain, were accusing them of the most heinous things. Sitting MPs right now were accusing the white helmet of being Al-Qaeda and all of this rubbish that they were saying. We need experts to help the Syrian civil society to locate the mass graves. 100,000 people were killed. This is Syria's Holocaust. We need them to help us find these mass graves because we need to find the evidence, because you cannot rebuild Syria without justice. Rebuilding a society will start with justice. The Syrian society is...
Hey.
The fabric of the Syrian society is torn. We need justice. And we cannot have justice if we don't find the evidence and if we don't get these criminals to court.
And that will involve outside help.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get emotional, but it's really hard.
There is not a human being listening to you who will have anything other than complete understanding for your emotion, myself included, obviously, because your work in this field has been so, it's defined your life, hasn't it, for the last 12 years. I would like to I would like to ask you what images of your home have struck you most? What are the actual scenes that you thought? The urgent case for rebuilding and healing notwithstanding, and the absolutely crucial role that the international community and the British government must play in that process. But I do wonder, as a friend, what images have struck you most? What have been the most, if I could use the word, beautiful scenes that you've seen in the last few days?
don't want to focus this. Listen, everything that is Syria associated with for the last 13 years is blood and destruction. Every time I tell someone that I am Syrian, the first thing they can think of is destruction and blood and dingies and refugees. Syrians are beautiful people. Our country is a gorgeous country. They are. Listen, I don't want to focus on the misery, because if you want to see the misery, go on Twitter, go on all social, you'll see. I don't want to talk about what I've seen. I swear to God, I haven't slept for more than 2 hours in the last week from the things that I've seen that are being uncovered. But what I've also seen, the things that stayed with me, is that the people are reuniting with their families. I don't know if you saw the clips of people after 10, 20, 30 years hugging their mothers. I've seen people, the first thing when they arrive to Syria is going to the cemetery to visit the dead that they couldn't say goodbye to because of living in exile. These images really stayed with me. There's nothing more important than family. So the scenes of people hugging their dads, their granddads, they're hugging their moms, the scenes of... I can't, James. I just can't talk anymore.
I won't. That's it. I won't keep you any longer, except to ask, when do you think you're going to get back?
I was planning on going on the 20th of December, but my cousins have told me to hold back a little bit because things are... I don't also listen. There's quite a lot of people who are going, Syrians, non-Syrians, and this is putting pressure on a country that is, you know, we need, in the future, we need everyone to go to Syria. Syrians, non-Syrians. You know, we need people to come and visit our beautiful country and see it and all of this. But I don't want to put pressure. I don't want to go there's queues for bread. There's queues for the necessities. I don't want to go just I don't want to be selfish. So I'm just waiting for things to get a tiny little bit more better, and then to be able to. And James, I want you to come. I want you to come. I want to show you where I live. I want you to come and sit on my balcony. I have the most beautiful balcony in Damascus. You can see all of the city. You're coming to visit me.
It's a date.
Inshallah.
Hassan Akkar, thank you. And try to get some sleep, my friend, won't you?
I will.
God bless you. Take care. Hassan Akkar there, who, as you heard, fled Damascus in fear for his own life during the civil war, had that face-to-face audience with a smirking Bashar al-Assad. And I know him well enough to say that I can absolutely guarantee he would have said what he said to the Syrian president. And, you don't need any more words from me.
James O'Brien on LBC.
A lot of love. You will not be surprised to learn that there's not much else in my inbox than admiration, love, and prayers for Hassan, my guest just a moment ago before the news, and someone whose story I'd go and listen to the Full Disclosure podcast if you want more understanding of the Syrian experience, the Syrian exodus. You can't say diaspora, can you, if it's kind of forced upon... Well, anyway, maybe you can. A complete change of pace now. I am interested in the... as you know, Benjamin Netanyahu's a bit busy today, facing bribery and fraud charges in Israel, where he's railing against the Israeli media. I don't suppose he can call them anti-Semitic, can he? As some people in this country are keen to label any critics of Benjamin Netanyahu in the British media. But I am interested in, as Hassan just referred to, the activities of the IDF in Syrian territory. But at the moment, the people we've spoken to are maintaining a watching brief, and so we don't really know what's going on. The IDF deny that they're advancing on Damascus, but we just had a first-hand account of some bombardments that seem at the very least questionable, a believed bombardment. So I am maintaining a watching brief, but as soon as there is something substantive or interesting to tell you, this is the place that you will hear it, all right? You're just going to have to trust me on that. But until there is, there's not a great deal we can do. So I steer you instead towards something that used to be. When did it all change for us, for you and me? Gosh, sounds like we're breaking up, doesn't it? It's not you, it's me. When did it all change? When did the programme sort of move into the space that it's in now? Was it Brexit? It probably was. But I don't know why, I've got a sense in my mind of a before and after. And I don't know what is the thing that we are before, and it must be Brexit, mustn't it? Or the realisation that there's a Rupert Murdoch story in the news today that proves several of my political points over the last years absolutely perfectly. But I think it's probably Brexit. I mean, the idea that a country like ours could fall victim to a scam, a con job, an epic confidence trick, and still 8 years later have people either pretending that it never happened or insisting that we stop talking about it. I don't know. But anyway, in the before period, the subjects we used to do a lot of before we were talking endlessly about conservative corruption and the consequences of becoming the first economy in the history of humanity to vote to impose economic sanctions on itself, the things I was enduringly fascinated by are sort of beginning to bubble back to the surface, aren't they? Although I don't think this one ever went away. Here's a headline. This is specific to England, but the ratios in Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland are better, but not enormously better, not exponentially better. Oh, Kathy says it's your therapy, James. It's not Brexit. That's when you change. No. I mean, I did, but that's not the before and after, because I would have been just as interested in these after as I was before. What am I talking about? I should probably tell you, shouldn't I? Listen to this sentence. Only the richest 10% of households can afford to buy an average-priced home in England, according to official figures that lay bare the scale of Britain's broken housing market. This comes from the Office for National Statistics. It's not from an estate agent or a PR agency. The Office for National Statistics has now described the cost of buying a home as unaffordable in every part of the UK except Northern Ireland. What's the phone in here? I know it's not like earth-shattering news because it speaks to a truth we've been aware of for ages. But what does this mean? Only the richest 10%. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that only 10% of people are going to be able to buy houses, because they'll be getting help from other households. But only 10%. So this is about income. Only 10% of households could now afford to. So people are going to be in houses that they've already bought. But if they had to start now on what they're currently earning, only 10% of households would be able to buy an average price home in England. It would take as many as 8.6 years of average annual household disposable income to afford an average price home. That's like all your money. That ratio is roughly double what it was in 1999. Only households with disposable incomes of at least £70,000, which would actually put you in the top 10%, could be considered reasonably able to afford an average priced home in the country. I have been having this phone in for a very long time, and it never ever gets tired for me, because I never stop being curious about what it's like to have your expectations almost completely destroyed by reality. But what is interesting is the passage of time. What is interesting is that when I started doing this, and listen, for the record, I got on the property ladder at the age of 28, and I did so with a 110% mortgage. And I was earning a very good salary at the time for someone of my age, but I had absolutely no savings. So what would have happened subsequently, I do not know. What would have happened instead, I do not know. Neither my wife nor I had any savings, but we had a dream. But we bought a flat with a 110% mortgage, which sounds like Mandarin to my young colleagues. As I've got young colleagues who want to get on the property ladder, and I say, well, we got a 110%. So again, I'm back to this week's recurring theme, and it's only Tuesday. People who think that the life world is the same as it was when they were young. Imagine telling someone who's on £60,000-70,000 and can't get on the property ladder that when you were their age, you got a 110% mortgage. So you could spend the 10% on anything you wanted. You didn't even have to spend it on furniture. You could spend it on sweets. I think we did, actually. 110% mortgage. So that's where I am. I am not under any illusions at all about, and I'm you know, privileged or whatever you want to call it, but not from a poor background, but no savings, no heft, no inheritance in my family for my parents. I don't know where I'd be if I was 28 now. I would not be able to buy, but that's what I'm saying. If I was 28 now, there's no earthly way I would have been able to buy a flat. or to get a mortgage. And what always interested me in the past was what that would have done to me moving forward, how that would have affected my relationship with life, my relationship with society. You remember I said to you at the outset this morning when we were talking about refugees that I lack whatever it is that gives people the drive to up sticks and go somewhere else, just for entirely social or economic reasons. I've got friends that did it. I was with a friend the other day who moved to India 15 years ago because he wanted an adventure. And obviously you've got to be in a degree of financial security even to contemplate that sort of move. But I could have all the financial security in the world and I don't think ever be capable of just moving to India because I wanted an adventure, or moving to America for my career, or moving. Do you see what I mean? I don't have it. But maybe if I hadn't grown up investing so much in the importance of owning property in this country, maybe one upside of that would have been a desire to go abroad more, to travel more. Because there's another story in the news today about 3/4 of young people would consider moving abroad as a consequence of the forecasts and economy in this country. Let's just hope that none of them asked their parents how they voted in the Brexit referendum, Because we used to have a wonderful thing called freedom of movement. And that's what I want to know. What's it? And the reason I mention the passage of time is because I think the question moves. I don't know what the answer is now. So 28-year-olds listening to this don't feel seen. That 28-year-olds listening to this now are not thinking, oh, well, I always thought I'd be able to buy a flat and now I've realised that I'm not. So when I started having these conversations, probably 15 years ago, probably just after the financial crisis, that's when everything changed, right? So when we started having these conversations, I would speak to you about the burgeoning realisation that you're probably not going to get on the property ladder when you thought you would. And then the next level of burgeoning realisation, you're not going to get on the property ladder ever. And you suddenly realise that. And it is absolutely, discombobulating. It's real pulling the rug from beneath your feet moment. Because I imagine me being 28, the financial crisis kicking in, just as I reached the point where I'd be looking to get property, and then realising that I can't do it without one. So that conversation doesn't work anymore because a 28-year-old listening to this thinks I'm talking gibberish. Don't be ridiculous. No one gets a flat at 28 unless their parents are millionaires or unless they've inherited a ton of money from their grandma or whatever it is. Do you see what I mean? So what age is it? The age you've reached and you think, I'm 38 now. I'm 48. What does it mean for a society, and this is why I'm broadening the question today to include people who are not unable to get on the property ladder and to include people who have. But what does it mean when home ownership is out of reach for so many people? There are two ways to answer this question, right? Well, there's probably more than two. There always is when I say things like that. You come on air and reveal that there are 30 different ways to answer this question. But I don't know that the people who can't afford to buy an average priced home but always thought they would, who grew up thinking they would, I don't know how big a constituency that is anymore. I really don't. So I'm going to ask that question anyway. What is it like to realise that the home ownership you took for granted as a younger person is probably out of your reach? 0345 6060 973. All right, that's what I want to know. So you are in this category of wondering whether you're ever going to be able to afford a home, or having accepted that you're never going to be able to afford a home. What does it do to you? Okay, 0345 6060 973. And then for the rest of us, we can be a bit more speculative. What does it mean? How does it change a society, if at all? And some of the little things I worry about are what on earth happens if we have a population living almost entirely in rented accommodation when they all reach retirement age. And what happens? Talking about the burdens of the welfare state already, but what happens when this generation reach retirement age and are living in rented accommodation? It's a huge time bomb, I'd have thought, for a society that's ticking on the horizon. People like me, ideally, touch wood, all being well, will have paid off our mortgage by the time we reach retirement age, and so we'll have no real property costs to absorb. So another massive gulf, and presumably the people with money or the people with assets will somehow be required to subsidise the people without the money or without the assets to keep a roof over their head. So it matters to everybody, whatever category you're in. So what's it like to be in this zone? And an average price home is £298,000 last year, for those of you asking. And what does it mean for society? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I haven't got the question. Somewhere, if you get those two questions and mash them together, you've got the question I'm trying to ask, but I haven't quite articulated it. So you've got the personal experience of not being able to afford a home, and then you've got the much broader relevance of the existence of the people who can't afford to buy a home. And I want both. What does it mean to me as a home? How does it change the way society functions and the way society feels? 0345 6060 973 is the number you need. It's 12:23.
James O'Brien on LBC.
12:24 is the time. Don't let me forget the Murdoch story today as well. And I did have you probably know the answer to this one, okay? Fight, 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 blank, launched by Trump. Do you know what it is? Fight, 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 blank, blank, or just blank. It works both ways. Launched by Trump. I don't imagine. I mean, the problem sometimes when a joke goes a little bit viral is that you never know who actually came up with it first. But the first person I've seen is Javier, who has blue skied me or posted me to say Leander Som. That's I like that. Well played. 25 after 12 is the time. Back to property, owning property. Naomi's in West Byfleet. Naomi, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi.
Hello.
Hi. I was just listening to you, and I was thinking, that's me.
Oh.
That's just all me. Me.
Go on.
Unfortunately. Basically, to cut a long story short, my husband and I bought a little flat when we were about 20, in our 20s,
right.
A long time ago. I'm 47 now, so that was back in 2007, something like that. We were affected by the crash in 2009.
So
and
you got in there just before the crash, really?
Just before.
Yes.
Just before. We were very... I don't even know how we did it. Oh, yeah, our parents have never helped us, so I remember we got a loan from the bank. They used to give loans for deposits then. So we got a loan, and then we said, well, we're going to get 100% mortgage, which they also did very easily.
So you borrowed the deposit and then got a 100% mortgage, which is a different version of my 110% mortgage, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, it was very easy, actually. We had a really nice bank manager, which we knew quite personally.
Sure.
So, again, that's very different. And we thought, this is easy. This is brilliant, and, affordable mortgage and everything. Yeah. We bought a little flat, and then we thought, let's, this was sort of later on. We had a girl who was 3.5 at the time. We thought, let's move on. But we should probably just sell the flat, pay off all our debts, student debts, blah, blah, blah. And then maybe next year we'll maybe buy somewhere. Yeah. And that was a long time ago, over 15, 16 years ago.
And it never happened. The world changed and you couldn't get back on the ladder.
Couldn't get back.
How does it, because we're of a similar age, and I think probably both grew up expecting, almost presuming that property ownership would be part of our adulthood, or certainly not expecting to be renting in your 30s, never mind your 40s. And I don't imagine it's something that's in the forefront of your mind all day, every day. But when annoying people on the radio bring it to the forefront of your mind in the way that I've just done, how does it make you feel?
Well, I actually do talk about it quite a lot with my husband, with my friends, with my clients, and because it's an issue for so many people, and it is a thing. I don't really know what we're supposed to do. We don't find it depressing every day and think, we've just accepted it because we're living in a nice house. It's not our house.
No.
It's our home.
So you have a nice life.
Oh, we have. Yeah, we both work. I've got my own business, which I've had for 18 years, which is another story. But we both work really hard. And actually, with not as much financial gain as we'd like, but that's having a small business. That's for another show. But so we can afford a mortgage, but we haven't got the down payment because our lives are too expensive, because our rent's really high, and we've got 3 children. And I know that was our choice, but we have got 3 children, and we're now going into being 48, and we're like, we still haven't. And that's why I say to people in their 20s, they're like, I just really want to, get on the ladder. And I said, I'm 47 and I haven't even bought a house yet. So don't worry about it. Don't let it stress you out.
You could say the opposite. You could have given them the opposite advice, which is don't put it off, because I'm 47 and I put it off and I haven't got it. So it could cut both. It could be a 52-48, Naomi, the infernal ratio. But are you there now for good, or are you waiting on inheritances? And I don't mean that in a morbid fashion, or I mean, are you resigned to never being a homeowner? Again?
We're probably going to, don't know, we're just sort of thinking outside the box. Maybe we'll just buy a little place abroad instead of actually buying in the UK. We're a bit like, why are we worried about buying a place in the UK anyway? Because we're both quite, we like to be a little bit unconventional with our plan.
Fair enough.
And also, my mum and dad know that there won't be any, I'm not expecting that's not a thing. And then my husband's maybe, but obviously they're both alive, and I don't know.
And long may that continue. So, in fact, albeit that you're not in the catchment area generationally speaking, the figures of younger people who are keen to or would be happy to move abroad, much higher than they were when we were their age. And now sort of 72% of 18 to 30-year-olds would consider it in the short or the long term. And that's probably part of what you've just described. And think, well, what's the point of doing it here if all I'm going to be doing is helping my landlord buy another property by paying their mortgage?
Definitely. Or only being able to afford a one-bedroom flat. I mean, we've looked at mortgages for us in our situation. We can only afford a 400. I know this might be a lot for some people, but I live in a really expensive part of the UK. But, we've got children at school, and so we're not just going to suddenly move to Manchester or somewhere that's
Northern Ireland.
A bit cheaper. Northern Ireland, we can't do that because of our children and their ages.
So you've cut your cloth, and that's why this is fascinating. That's why I talked about the age being really relevant to this conversation, because this is a different story from the one we would have had 15 years ago or 20 years ago, at which point you'd have thought you were in a temporary scenario and now the world has changed, and your feelings and sensibilities and attitudes have changed accordingly. Which is why there's part 2 of this phone-in, which is, what does that mean for a society? Relatively high-earning, successful professionals for whom property ownership is just slipped over the horizon. Property ownership in this country may not mean anything, but I sense it means something. Naomi, thank you. 12:31 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 12:34. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Fight, blank, launched by Trump. I mean, talk about rewriting the rules of engagement. This is a new fragrance that the president-elect is marketing in time for Christmas. So it's a perfume. A lot of you wondered whether it was a Penny Mordaunt branded product. That would be Stand and Fight, wouldn't it? She might get one out if she's quick. They could be next to each other on the shelves. What do you think a Penny Mordaunt fragrance would smell of? Could you bear to imagine what a Donald Trump branded fragrance might smell of? Take that as rhetorical. Please don't fill my inbox with filth. And to advertise it, they've taken advantage of the fact that Jill Biden behaved in a civilized manner towards him at the Notre Dame reopening ceremony. So they've been able to put a fragrance your enemies can't resist. So even a political foe being polite is a business opportunity for Donald Trump to sell perfume. But hey-ho, drink those liberal tears. He could do that as well, couldn't he? He could put that next to liberal tears perfume. What do you think that would smell of? Rightness. 12:35 is the time. And the Murdoch story, which is, of course, relevant to the rise of people like Trump. Murdoch's trying to ensure... Well, Murdoch has failed, actually, to ensure that he can pass on his media empire to one son. He wants to give it all to the oldest son, Lachlan Murdoch, when the trust that was established in 2006 divided control of Fox News and News Corp, which of course owns the Sun and the Times in this country, equally between his 4 eldest children in the event of his death. So the proposed amendment would keep the shares divided equally, but would hand control of the empire to the oldest son, squeezing out James Murdoch, Elizabeth Murdoch, and Prudence Murdoch. There's a sealed document seen by the New York Times. This is fascinating. The reason why Rupert Murdoch, who, remember, never interferes in editorial decisions, he's told a parliamentary inquiry that, I think, was it on the humblest day of his life, that he revealed he'd never been involved in telling editors what they can and can't do. But the reason why, in his sealed testimony, the reason why he wants to make sure that the entire empire goes to his oldest son is because Lachlan Murdoch's more right-wing stance would better ensure the financial security of the business. So the entire argument hinges upon the fact that you can make more money from punting right-wing poison than you can from doing proper Who knew? Who knew? In other words, Rupert Murdoch's in court at the moment trying to deny 3 of his children their birthright because there's a hell of a lot more people queuing up for the ghost train than there are for the speak your weight machine, isn't it? I mean, is there ever been a better example, A, of how ridiculous it is for anyone to either believe, repeat, or accept that Rupert Murdoch never interferes in the editorial policies of his outlets, and B, the admission that it's all about the money. You make much more money from being more right-wing. What happened to the idea of the biggest rewards in journalism being reserved for the people closest to telling the truth? It's incredible, isn't it? Absolutely incredible. Anyway, he's going to appeal it. And I think the ruling still needs to be ratified by the by the probate court. But there it is, actually revealing in sealed documents that it's all about the Benjamins. Back to home ownership, which is not something that the Murdochs are ever going to have to worry about. Robbie's in Carlisle. Robbie, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. How are you doing?
Very well, Robbie. What's on your mind?
Oh, it's just everything that's kind of tying together with people struggling to have property ownership, speaking as a 30-year-old, tying in with people just not wanting to work, apparently.
Yeah.
Apparently no one's wanting to work anymore. And you just feel that with this social contract that's been broken, it is clearly, what is the point in working? I'm never going to own a house. And
this is what I meant. This is the second bit of the convo. I mean, for you, you're answering both questions, but that's what I was trying to articulate, the sense of something changing. Because for me, it's always been about assembling something secure that I then have, whatever happens. And if it's rent, that never happens.
No, it's making something secure for the person that actually owns the flat that I'm in right now. But for me, I think it might be more sensible just to buy a camper van and live in that.
Well, it's incredible. We laugh, but it's increasingly popular. And we've had calls in the not too distant past from people who are doing it. One of my colleagues, his best friends, is doing it at the moment. And how conscious of it are you? How I mean, because the last thing I want to do is depress people or drag to the forefront. As I said to Naomi, that if you're not thinking about this a lot, I don't really want to be responsible for hitting you over the back of the head with it. So it's not going to be a topic we do every day. But how conscious are you of this weird breach in the previous social contract? In return for my labour, I will get security.
Daily. I mean,
really?
Every time, in my situation, because my mum's not well, so I also care for her as well as work. But my mum's got a disease where she's not going to be here for much longer, sadly. And that's kind of the only chance I'm ever going to get of owning a home is when my mum pops her clogs, essentially.
Oh, so now you feel guilty for even thinking that.
Yeah, there's that. And every month when I do get paid, all the money's gone out towards bills, mainly on rent, food. Yeah. And then I think, what money have I got left to actually put towards some savings to save towards a deposit? Oh, pennies, nothing at all.
So the light at the end of the tunnel edges never closer. There's no sense of making progress.
Exactly.
It's hamster wheel stuff, isn't it? You're pedaling to just stay exactly where you were. You're pedaling to stay still. You're not pedaling to get ahead or to move forward.
You're just basically treading water, never actually going anywhere further forward.
When did this land for you? Because 30 is quite an interesting age for this. Because I presume that when you were 20, you didn't even think about stuff. Well, you may have done. Forgive me. I knew I didn't want to stay in the UK when I grew up. Well, that's come back round again as well.
So because I'm a musician.
Right.
Well, I was a musician, but again, the arts has just been knocked on its feet since Brexit and because of COVID.
Yeah.
But my plan was to move to France once I graduated university, but I graduated in 2016, which wasn't good timing.
No.
So then getting trapped here, freedom of movement being stripped away, and ever diminishing wages to actually put away and thinking, right, am I going to be able to afford a visa to go anywhere else? No. Okay, I'm going to be stuck in the UK. Am I ever going to be able to afford to live anywhere in the UK? No. So it's just month on month, year on year, I'm making less and less money. Well, I'm making slightly more money, but the cost of everything is far exceeding that. So, yeah, it's kind of treading water but slowly sinking. So why the hell do I keep pushing on? Why do I keep working?
Because you sort of feel you have to. But as you alluded to at the beginning of the call, for an increasing number of people, the evidence seems to suggest that they've sort of taken their foot off the pedal because they can just about survive without the pushing and the striving, because the rewards you get for the pushing and the striving are negligible. I don't want to add to your burdens, Robbie.
Oh, don't worry.
But we mentioned that 30 was an interest. You know what's going to happen next, don't you?
Shoot.
Well, I think Rachel Reeves might be able to negotiate some form of freedom of movement for 18 to 30-year-olds.
That'll be very appeasing.
Well, it won't, though, will it? Because by the time it kicks in, you're going to be 31.
And there's the kick in the teeth.
I warned you. I said I didn't want to add to you, but I feel terrible now. Just because the timing of graduating in 2016 as well. That's
it.
Well, anyway, let's hope that's the starting point. If she manages to negotiate something for 18 to 30-year-olds, although she's playing hardball, she was going to be the contender for the conversation at 12 o'clock today, actually, alongside the house prices. But the European capitals will demand a free movement deal for their young people and better fishing rights for EU boats in UK waters if Rachel Reeves's hopes of better trade and security ties are to be revived. And if we had done this as a topic, the question was going to be about whether Rachel Reeves actually understands the reality of Brexit any better than the people who delivered it do, because we are now essentially supine. Well, we are essentially saying to the massive organisation, please may we have more, to which they respond saying, yeah, of course you can, and in the meanwhile we'll have that and that, albeit that freedom of movement for European young people, reciprocal freedom of movement would be fantastic for everybody involved. What British politicians have to do is get it past the racists. It's coming up to 12:44. Oh, which reminds me that there's a billionaire property tycoon who's just become treasurer of Nigel Farage's party. He couldn't make it up, so that'll really help the ordinary striving working people of this country to have a billionaire property tycoon in charge of the cash over at Reform. Shall we squeeze in John in Oakley? I think we will. John, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello, John.
I agree with almost everything that the last caller said. I was just lucky enough to be on the other side of it.
Yes.
I joined the military just as the crash happened in 2008, and I managed to buy a flat for I think around 70 when no one could get any borrowing. But with a secure job, I was able to get on the property ladder, and I've continued from there and carried. I've bought a few more properties. I don't want to sound like a hypocrite.
You don't sound like. Well, but I think you're underpinning everything you're saying is that if you were trying to do now what you managed to do then, you wouldn't be able to.
Absolutely not. I've never earned more than around £30,000.
See, people listening to this are going to be stunned, aren't they? And now, because you had that equity, that initial property, you could use that to sort of bankroll a buy to let.
I own 8 now. I own eight properties. I've never earned more than £30,000. I don't put my rent up when there's people in there. Certainly not anything above inflation or any other measure. I've got places that I want to sell now, but there's people who live in my town in North Essex. That local people are moving to the caravan camp because they can't afford to rent anything, and these are people who aren't unfortunately aren't going to be in a position to buy, whether they don't earn enough money to be able to qualify for any sort of lending, even before the economic crash, when lending was a lot more frivolous. So that's what got us in the position in the first place. But there's nowhere to rent. There's no and the places to buy are unaffordable, except to people like me.
Yeah,
but there's still not enough of them.
It's no, I mean it is. I don't know what it is. A time bomb. I mean the 1.5 million houses that the government have pledged to build might. I mean I think that would touch the sides. That would make a difference. But then you've got this entire generation who's going to get on the ladder. So people are going to have been passed over, or people are going to have missed. And what happens? And this isn't why you've rung in, but if I have to worry about it, then you can too. What happens when all of the people that are paying you rent at the moment reach retirement age? They're not going to be able to retire.
I don't know.
I don't know either. But you've done well, and you're not a hypocrite because you act. Now, all you have to do to be.
Yeah, but
go on.
I didn't do well. I was lucky.
Well, you have done. You weren't just lucky. It's not like you walked out the house one day and 8 houses landed in your lap, is it? Or you did a scratch card and it came up 8 houses. You did your homework. And
but there's but I just want to go the other way because there's so many people with property investors who think they're.
They think they're geniuses.
Trump's a bad example, but they think they're business. I mean, he bought real estate in New York City.
I know.
Or he inherited real estate in New York City.
Yes, you do not have to be a financial. Well, you start with a small fortune and arguably make a slightly bigger one, although even that's questionable in his case. And that's why I say you're completely immune from the hypocrisy accusation, because if you'd come on and said, well, I found it really easy, I don't know what these young people are complaining about, then you become part of the problem, or you become a part of the big problem, which is the generational divide as well. Although I think that's getting better, don't you? It's always a little bit like the VAT on private school fees argument. I don't know how many phone-ins you've heard about that, but you'll always hear people saying, I work bloody hard. I work hard. As if people who can't never in a million years afford to send their children to private school don't work hard. There's no acknowledgement of luck or advantage or privilege even, or entitlement. It's always, oh yes, I worked. How dare they? I've heard people deny the existence of poverty for parents who are struggling to feed their kids and then get out the world's tiniest violins. Actually, no, that's not true. That's sarcastic. They get out the world's biggest violins for people who say they won't be able to afford private school fees when it reaches 20%. That's a similar form of hypocrisy when people say, well, I found it very easy to buy a house in 1843. Therefore, I don't know what young people today are complaining about.
James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10 to 1. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This is an interesting one. Everyone born in Britain is born privileged, James. Would you rather be Syrian? I'm British and I'm not giving it up for anyone. Listen, I agree, but of course you can't tell people who are unhappy with their lot that they are privileged. It's why the phrase white privilege has been hijacked by liars and racists, because there are white people who are poverty stricken, and to tell them that they are privileged, all you're saying is you have the privilege of not being a victim of racism. but you call it white privilege and people can use it to pretend that you're being told to shut up or to stop complaining. Anyway, we digress slightly. We may hopefully we'll have time for a couple more calls on property ownership and what it does to you as a person and what it does to us as a society to make it so out of reach for so many. But before that, our colleague Chris Chambers, as you may have heard on LBC over the last couple of days, has been doing some incredibly powerful and important work in the arena of unmarked mass graves. And yet we are talking about the United Kingdom. And the latest development involves no fewer than 5. Well, why don't I let Chris tell you the story? He's LBC's correspondent in the Northwest, and this is an exclusive piece of journalism that he's been working extremely hard on. And the results, albeit that the backdrop is so heartbreaking, Chris, the results are now coming in.
That's right. Afternoon, James. We reported last month on the discovery of a mass grave in Oldham, 300 or so stillborn babies in an unmarked grave in Royton Cemetery. We found there were more of these graves on the Wirral, and we've heard anecdotally over the last month or so how up to until the late 80s, there was a culture where parents would routinely be lied to about what happened to the remains of their babies. They were told they'd be buried in a plot with a nice person who had died the same day, when in fact the reality was very different. We found there are at least 89,000 stillborn babies buried in mass graves across England. For scale, that's like filling Wembley Stadium. And there are parents and siblings who for decades have been trying to work out where their babies are. Gina, Diana and Amanda are just three of them and have been speaking to LBC.
We weren't allowed to see, hold, name, whatever. We were just told that they would be taken and put that day in the grave with someone else.
They're just landfill. They've just been tossed in there and that's it. Cover up the layer and then the next layer goes on.
I live in Brighton. My parents are from Brighton. And they're buried in Brighton Cemetery, and they would have walked through Brighton Cemetery so many times, never knowing that their babies were there.
For lots of people, this is utterly shocking. The scale of how many babies are in these mass graves and the manner in which they were being disposed of. But not everybody is surprised. Lady Ailish Angelini carried out an investigation into the disposal of baby ashes at Morton Hall Crematorium in Scotland back in 2013. After it emerged there that parents weren't being told what was happening to their baby's ashes. She's told LBC it sadly doesn't come as a surprise.
I had an inclination when I was doing this that this might be a practice that was wider but had no basis for that other than no evidence base to consider that was the case. But at that time, a number of councils said they were going to look into matters, and I hope they did. But this was a Scottish report. But I very much hope that they can get support and recognise that some of them will be re-grieving again, and that it's really important that they find sources of support and that sources of support are provided for these families because they will need some advice and guidance.
Anecdotally, we've been told this was a practice that happened up until around the late 80s, but there are feelings it may have been going on until much more recently. The former Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt has been speaking to LBC and giving his reaction to what we found out.
Utterly shocking. And frankly, I can see how, 30, 40, 50 years ago, life was a bit cheaper and some awful things happened in health services all over the world. But I think this was going on until really quite recently, including, I fear, during the period I was health secretary. So, it's very important that it's now come to light and will be dealt with.
He is one of 5 former health secretaries who are now backing calls for a national memorial to remember these babies, because although some families have been able to locate their stillborns, records are so patchy that many of them are handwritten in big ledgers, some records which just don't exist. So for many it will be an impossible task, and the feeling is if there was somewhere people could go to lay flowers or say a prayer, that might be in some way comforting for them.
Thank you, Chris. Is there any evidence, or have you come across people who are still looking, still searching, who are falling victim to that scenario you just described?
Absolutely. I mean, lots of people are coming out of the woodwork, if you like, now, because up until they heard other people's stories, they were of the opinion that what they were told at the time was just what happened. They believed they were being buried with other adults on that day and not placed in a corner and then put in a mass grave along with hundreds of other babies. And this was going on not just in Oldham, where we found this most recent grave, but all around the country. And, these people have been living with it for 10, 20, 30 years. And, lots of parents have died not knowing where their babies are, when in actual fact, one of the ladies we heard from in the first clip there, it was just down the road and they'd walked past it day after day after day and never known they were there.
Yeah, that is heartbreaking. You mentioned the national memorial. I think some of the local councils are taking, making efforts closer to home as well.
Yeah, that's right. Oldham Council have announced today that they are going to put some benches in the cemeteries as a gesture to, have a place where people can come and sit and be reflective. But I certainly think for areas where, this is, less discovered, if you like, there's still a feeling where lots of people are in the dark and want answers and want somewhere where they can go and get some peace and comfort.
Chris Chambers, thank you so much. LBC's reporter in the Northwest with a continuing exclusive, really, investigation, not just into the tens of thousands of stillborn babies buried in unmarked mass graves, but now also in the political response and the reactions of families affected. Some of the testimony there, and you can read more about this on the LBC website, some of the testimony there almost unbearably poignant. It is 12:57. I've got 2 calls waiting. I've only got time for one of them. Alex is in Burnham and Talia is in Estepona in Spain. And I took a call from Estepona last week and I didn't ask the caller whether or not the go-kart track was still there, that I have very fond memories of from when I was 9 years old. So I haven't got time to talk to Talia about what she's called in to talk about because I'm going to talk to Alex quickly. But Talia, can I ask you very quickly, is the go-kart track still there?
There is one here. I don't know if it's the same one, but there is one here. You can always come back.
I could come back and visit. I've got quite sad memories of that go-kart track, but I haven't got time to tell you why. I promise we'll put you to the front of the queue next time you ring in. Alex, back to the property conversation. What did you want to say?
Yes, hi, James.
Hello. Is there a go-kart track in Burnham?
No, but there is in Maidenhead. So
there we go. There we go. Carry on. Property.
Yes, well, basically I've been looking for a house for about 3 years, and it's got to the point where I went to look at some places, and they're actually decent prices. So, like, it came to about 180, I think was one I went to look for. But then the service charge on them was $4,500, and trying to have a decent mortgage with that on top, it just wasn't going to work. I mean, I was earning $32,000 a year at the time, and even then it was still unaffordable.
What does it do to you? What does it do to you? I mean, is it slipping out of reach, or are you just redoubling your efforts to get there?
Well, this is the thing. So I've just changed careers and become self-employed. Yeah.
Well, that'll make it harder, won't it?
Yeah, it will. But it's made me a lot happier in terms of what I do for work. So that's positive side. But yeah, realistically, it's a lot harder now. Even to be self-employed and get a place, you need to have records of income, etc. And it's become very much more apparent that it may not be a best idea if I wanted to move out. But
well, you never know. You might make your millions being self-employed, and it'll all become academic in the long run. I'm not being glib, but I tell you what, you make me wonder whether or not there'll ever be a return. As you think of the property market as cyclical. I don't know why I'm doing that. That's not cyclical, is it? That's like a roller coaster.
Up and down.
Up and down. Thank you, Sheila. Sheila is providing sorts of subtitle translations on this break. But I don't know if it's ever going to come back. Are we ever going to be sitting here thinking, oh, that's good, my kids can get a 110% mortgage? I don't know, but I do know that I've done the missing word. It was fragrance. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio, as well as listen to a range of podcasts. Download it now for free from your app store, or head to globalplayer.com. Coming up at 4 on LBC, it's Tom Swarbrick, but now it's Sheila Fogarty.
Thanks very much, James.
James O'Brien on LBC.